Chapter 7, Part 1 of Lady Molly of Scotland Yard by Baroness Orczy. This Libivox recording is in the public domain. A Christmas Tragedy, Part 1. It was a fairly merry Christmas party, although the surliness of our host somewhat marred the festivities. But imagine two such beautiful young women as my own dear lady and Margaret Seeley, and a Christmas Eve Cinderella in the beautiful ballroom at Clevere Hall, and you will understand that even Major Seeley's well-known cantankerous temper could not altogether spoil the merriment of a good old-fashioned festive gathering. It is a far cry from a Christmas Eve party to a series of cattle-maiming outrages, yet I am forced to mention these now, for although they were ultimately proved to have no connection with the murder of the unfortunate Major, yet they were undoubtedly the means whereby the miscreant was enabled to accomplish the horrible deed with surety, swiftness, and, as it turned out afterwards, a very grave chance of immunity. Everyone in the neighbourhood had been taking the keenest possible interest in those dastardly outrages against innocent animals. They were either the work of desperate ruffians who stick at nothing in order to obtain a few shillings, or else of madmen with weird propensities for purposeless crimes. Once or twice suspicious characters had been seen lurking about in the fields, and on more than one occasion a cart was heard in the middle of the night driving away at furious speed. Whenever this occurred, the discovery of a fresh outrage was sure to follow, but so far the miscreants had succeeded in baffling not only the police, but also the many farm hands who had formed themselves into a band of volunteer watchmen, determined to bring the cattle-maimers to justice. We had all been talking about these mysterious events during the dinner which preceded the dance at Clevere Hall, but later on, when the young people had assembled, and when the first strains of the Merry Widow waltz had set us aglow with prospective enjoyment, the unpleasant topic was wholly forgotten. The guests went away early, Major Seeley as usual doing nothing to detain them, and by midnight all of us who were staying in the house had gone up to bed. My dear lady and I shared a bedroom and dressing-room together, our windows giving on the front. Clevere Hall is, as you know, not very far from York, on the other side of Bishopthorpe, and is one of the finest old mansions in the neighbourhood, its only disadvantage being that, in spite of the gardens being very extensive in the rear, the front of the house lies very near the road. It was about 2 hours after I had switched off the electric light and called out "Good night" to my dear lady, that something roused me out of my first sleep. Suddenly I felt very wide awake, and sat up in bed. Most unmistakably, though still from some considerable distance along the road, came the sound of a cart being driven at unusual speed. Evidently my dear lady was also awake. She jumped out of bed, and drawing aside the curtains, looked out of the window. The same idea had, of course, flashed upon us both at the very moment of waking. All the conversations anent the cattle-maimers and their cart, which we had heard since our arrival at Clevere, recurring to our minds simultaneously. I had joined Lady Molly beside the window, and I don't know how many minutes we remained there in observation, not more than 2 probably, for anon the sound of the cart died away in the distance along a side road. Suddenly we were startled with a terrible cry of "Murder! Help! Help!" issuing from the other side of the house, followed by an awful, deadly silence. I stood there near the window shivering with terror, while my dear lady, having already turned on the light, was hastily slipping into some clothes. The cry had, of course, aroused the entire household, but my dear lady was even then the first to get downstairs, and to reach the garden door at the back of the house, whence the weird and despairing cry had undoubtedly proceeded. That door was wide open. 2 steps lead from it to the terraced walk which borders the house on that side, and along these steps Major Seeley was lying, face downwards, with arms outstretched, and a terrible wound between his shoulder blades. A gun was lying close by, his own. It was easy to conjecture that he, too, hearing the rumble of the wheels, had run out, gun in hand, meaning, no doubt, to effect, or at least to help, in the capture of the escaping criminals. Someone had been lying in wait for him. That was obvious. Someone who had perhaps waited and watched for this special opportunity for days or even weeks, in order to catch the unfortunate man unawares. Well, it were useless to recapitulate all the various little incidents which occurred from the moment when Lady Molly and the butler first lifted the Major's lifeless body from the terrace steps, until that instant when Miss Seeley, with remarkable coolness and presence of mind, gave what details she could of the terrible event to the local police inspector and to the doctor, both hastily summoned. These little incidents, with but slight variations, occur in every instance when a crime has been committed. The broad facts alone are of weird and paramount interest. Major Seeley was dead. He had been stabbed with amazing sureness and terrible violence in the back. The weapon used must have been some sort of heavy clasp knife. The murdered man was now lying in his own bedroom upstairs, even as the Christmas bells, on that cold, crisp morning, sent cheering echoes through the stillness of the air. We had, of course, left the house, as had all the other guests. Everyone felt the deepest possible sympathy for the beautiful young girl who had been so full of the joy of living but a few hours ago, and was now the pivot round which revolved the weird shadow of tragedy, of curious suspicions, and of an ever-growing mystery. But at such times all strangers, acquaintances, and even friends in a house are only an additional burden to an already overwhelming load of sorrow and of trouble. We took up our quarters at the Black Swan in York. The local superintendent, hearing that Lady Molly had been actually a guest at Clevere on the night of the murder, had asked her to remain in the neighbourhood. There was no doubt that she could easily obtain the chief's consent to assist the local police in the elucidation of this extraordinary crime. At this time, both her reputation and her remarkable powers were at their zenith, and there was not a single member of the entire police force in the kingdom who would not have availed himself gladly of her help when confronted with a seemingly impenetrable mystery. That the murder of Major Seeley threatened to become such no one could deny. In cases of this sort, when no robbery of any kind has accompanied the graver crime, it is the duty of the police and also of the coroner to try to find out, first and foremost, what possible motive there could be behind so cowardly an assault, and among motives, of course, deadly hatred, revenge, and animosity stand paramount. But here the police were at once confronted with the terrible difficulty, not of discovering whether Major Seeley had an enemy at all, but rather which, of all those people who owed him a grudge, hated him sufficiently to risk hanging for the sake of getting him out of the way. As a matter of fact, the unfortunate Major was one of those miserable people who seem to live in a state of perpetual enmity with everything and everybody. Morning, noon, and night he grumbled, and when he did not grumble he quarrelled, either with his own daughter, or with the people of his household, or with his neighbours. I had often heard about him and his eccentric, disagreeable ways from Lady Molly, who had known him for many years. She, like everybody in the county who otherwise would have shunned the old man, kept a semblance of friendship with him for the sake of his daughter. Margaret Seeley was a singularly beautiful girl, and as the Major was reputed to be very wealthy, these two facts perhaps combined to prevent the irascible gentleman from living in quite so complete an isolation as he would have wished. Mammas of marriageable young men vied with one another in their welcome to Miss Seeley at garden parties, dances, and bazaars. Indeed, Margaret had been surrounded with admirers ever since she had come out of the schoolroom. Needless to say, the cantankerous Major received these pretenders to his daughter's hand not only with insolent disdain, but at times even with violent opposition. In spite of this, the moths fluttered round the candle, and amongst this venturesome tribe none stood out more prominently than Mr. Lawrence Smethick, son of the M.P. for the Pakethorpe division. Some folk there were who vowed that the young people were secretly engaged, in spite of the fact that Margaret was an outrageous flirt, and openly encouraged more than one of her crowd of adorers. Be that as it may, one thing was very certain, namely, that Major Seeley did not approve of Mr. Smethick any more than he did of the others, and there had been more than one quarrel between the young man and his prospective father-in-law. On that memorable Christmas Eve at Clevere, none of us could fail to notice his absence, whilst Margaret, on the other hand, had shown marked predilection for the society of Captain Glynn, who, since the sudden death of his cousin, Viscount Heslington, Lord Ullesthorpe's only son, who was killed in the hunting field last October, if you remember, had become heir to the earldom and its £40,000 a year. Personally, I strongly disapproved of Margaret's behaviour the night of the dance. Her attitude with regard to Mr. Smethick, whose constant attendance on her had justified the rumour that they were engaged, being more than callous. On the morning of December 24th, Christmas Eve in fact, the young man had called at Clevere. I remember seeing him just as he was being shown into the boudoir downstairs. A few moments later the sound of angry voices rose with appalling distinctness from that room. We all tried not to listen, yet could not fail to hear Major Ceely's overbearing words of rudeness to the visitor, who, it seems, had merely asked to see Miss Ceely, and had been most unexpectedly confronted by the irascible and extremely disagreeable Major. Of course, the young man speedily lost his temper too, and the whole incident ended with a very unpleasant quarrel between the two men in the hall, and with the Major peremptorily forbidding Mr. Smethick ever to darken his doors again. On that night Major Ceely was murdered. A Christmas Tragedy, Part 2. Of course, at first, no one attached any importance to this weird coincidence. The very thought of connecting the idea of murder with the personality of a bright, good-looking young Yorkshireman like Mr. Smethick seemed indeed preposterous, and with one accord all of us who were practically witnesses to the quarrel between the two men tacitly agreed to say nothing at all about it at the inquest, unless we were absolutely obliged to do so on oath. In view of the Major's terrible temper, this quarrel, mind you, had not the importance which it otherwise would have had, and we all flattered ourselves that we had well succeeded in parrying the coroner's questions. The verdict at the inquest was against some person or persons unknown, and I, for one, was very glad that young Smethick's name had not been mentioned in connection with this terrible crime. 2 days later the superintendent at Bishopthorpe sent an urgent telephonic message to Lady Molly, begging her to come to the police station immediately. We had the use of a motor all the while that we stayed at the Black Swan, and in less than 10 minutes we were bowling along at express speed towards Bishopthorpe. On arrival we were immediately shown into Superintendent Eddy's private room behind the office. He was there talking with Danvers, who had recently come down from London. In a corner of the room, sitting very straight on a high-backed chair, was a youngish woman of the servant class, who, as we entered, cast a quick and I thought suspicious glance at us both. She was dressed in a coat and skirt of shabby-looking black, and although her face might have been called good-looking, for she had fine dark eyes, her entire appearance was distinctly repellent. It suggested slatternliness in an unusual degree. There were holes in her shoes and in her stockings, the sleeve of her coat was half unsewn, and the braid on her skirt hung in loops all around the bottom. She had very red and very coarse-looking hands, and undoubtedly there was a furtive expression in her eyes, which, when she began speaking, changed to one of defiance. Eddy came forward with great alacrity when my dear lady entered. He looked perturbed, and seemed greatly relieved at the sight of her. "She is the wife of one of the outdoor men at Clevere," he explained rapidly to Lady Molly, nodding in the direction of the young woman, "and she has come here with such a queer tale that I thought you would like to hear it." "She knows something about the murder?" asked Lady Molly. "No, I didn't say that," here interposed the woman roughly. "Don't you go and tell no lies, Master Inspector. I thought as how you might wish to know what my husband saw on the night when the Major was murdered, that's all, and I've come to tell you." "Why didn't your husband come himself?" asked Lady Molly. "Oh, Haggett ain't well enough, she began explaining, with a careless shrug of the shoulders, "so to speak." "The fact of the matter is, my lady," interposed Eddy, "this woman's husband is half-witted. I believe he is only kept on in the garden because he is very strong and can help with the digging. It is because his testimony is so little to be relied on that I wish to consult you as to how we should act in the matter." "What is his testimony, then?" "Tell this lady what you have just told us, Mrs. Haggett, will you?" said Eddy curtly. Again that quick, suspicious glance shot into the woman's eyes. Lady Molly took the chair which Danvers had brought forward for her, and sat down opposite Mrs. Haggett, fixing her earnest, calm gaze upon her. "There's not much to tell," said the woman sullenly. "Haggett is certainly queer in his head sometimes, and when he is queer, he goes wandering about the place o' nights." "Yes?" said my lady, for Mrs. Haggett had paused a while, and now seemed unwilling to proceed. "Well," she resumed with sudden determination, He had got up one of his queer fits on Christmas Eve, and didn't come in till long after midnight. He told me as how he'd seen a young gentleman prowling about a garden on the terrace side. He heard the cry of murder and help soon after that, and ran home because he was frightened." "Home?" said Lady Molly quietly. "Where is home?" "The cottage where we live, just back of the kitchen garden." "Why didn't you tell all this to the superintendent before?" "Because Haggett only told me last night, when he seemed less queer like. He is mighty silent when the fits are on him." "Did he know who the gentleman was whom he saw?" "No, ma'am. I don't suppose he did. Leastwise, he wouldn't say, but—" "Yes, but—" "He found this in the garden yesterday," said the woman, holding out a screw of paper which apparently she had held tightly clutched up to now. "And maybe that's what brought Christmas Eve and the murder back to his mind." Lady Molly took the thing from her and undid the soiled bit of paper with her dainty fingers. The next moment she held up for Etty's inspection a beautiful ring composed of an exquisitely carved moonstone surrounded with diamonds of unusual brilliance. At the moment the setting and the stones themselves were marred by scraps of sticky mud which clung to them, the ring obviously having lain on the ground, and perhaps being trampled on for some days, and then been only very partially washed. "At any rate you can find out the ownership of the ring," commented my dear lady after a while, in answer to Etty's silent attitude of expectancy. "There would be no harm in that." Then she turned once more to the woman. "I'll walk with you to your cottage, if I may," she said decisively, "and have a chat with your husband. Is he at home?" I thought Mrs. Haggett took this suggestion with marked reluctance. I could well imagine from her own personal appearance that her home was most unlikely to be in a fit state for a lady's visit. However, she could, of course, do nothing but obey, and after a few muttered words of grudging acquiescence, she rose from her chair and stalked towards the door, leaving my lady to follow as she chose. Before going, however, she turned and shot an angry glance at Etty. "You'll give me back the ring, Master Inspector," she said with her usual tone of sullen defiance. "Findings is keepings, you know." "I'm afraid not," replied Etty curtly, "but there's always the reward offered by Miss Ceely for information which would lead to the apprehension of her father's murderer. You may get that, you know. It is £100. "Yes, I knew that," she remarked dryly, as, without further comment, she finally went out of the room. A Christmas Tragedy, Part 3. My dear lady came back very disappointed from her interview with Haggett. It seems that he was indeed half-witted, almost an imbecile in fact, with but a few lucid intervals, of which this present day was one. But, of course, his testimony was practically valueless. He reiterated the story already told by his wife, adding no details. He had seen a young gentleman roaming on the terraced walk on the night of the murder. He did not know who the young gentleman was. He was going homewards when he heard the cry of murder, and ran to his cottage because he was frightened. He picked up the ring yesterday in the perennial border below the terrace and gave it to his wife. Two of these brief statements made by the imbecile were easily proved to be true, and my dear lady had ascertained this before she returned to me. One of the Clevere under-gardeners said he had seen Haggett running home in the small hours of that fateful Christmas morning. He himself had been on the watch for the cattle-maimers that night, and remembered the little circumstance quite plainly. He added that Haggett certainly looked to be in a panic. Then Newby, another outdoor-man at the Hall, saw Haggett pick up the ring in the perennial border, and advised him to take it to the police. Somehow, all of us who were so interested in that terrible Christmas tragedy felt strangely perturbed at all this. No names had been mentioned as yet, but whenever my dear lady and I looked at one another, or whenever we talked to Etty or Danvers, we all felt that a certain name, one particular personality, was lurking at the back of all our minds. The two men, of course, had no sentimental scruples to worry them. Taking the Haggett story merely as a clue, they worked diligently on that, with the result that 24 hours later Etty appeared in our private room at the Black Swan, and calmly informed us that he had just got a warrant out against Mr. Lawrence Smethick on a charge of murder, and was on his way even now to effect the arrest. "Mr. Smethick did not murder Major Ceely," was Lady Molly's firm and only comment when she heard the news. "Well, my lady, that's as it may be," rejoined Etty, speaking with that deference with which the entire force invariably addressed my dear lady. "But we have collected a sufficiency of evidence, at any rate, to justify the arrest, and in my opinion enough of it to hang any man. Mr. Smethick purchased the moonstone and diamond ring at Nicholson's in Coney Street about a week ago. He was seen abroad on Christmas Eve by several persons, loitering about the gates of Clevere Hall, somewhere about the time when the guests were leaving after the dance, and again, some few moments after the first cry of murder had been heard. His own valet admits that his master did not get home that night until long after 2 a.m., whilst even Miss Granard here won't deny that there was a terrible quarrel between Mr. Smethick and Major Ceely less than 24 hours before the latter was murdered." Lady Molly offered no remark to this array of facts which Etty had thus pitilessly marshalled before us, but I could not help from exclaiming, "Mr. Smethick is innocent, I am sure." "I hope for his sake he may be," retorted Etty gravely, "but somehow 'tis a pity that he don't seem to be able to give a good account of himself between midnight and 2 o'clock on Christmas morning." "Oh!" I ejaculated. "What does he say about that?" "Nothing," said the man dryly. "That's just the trouble." Well, of course, as you who read the papers will doubtless remember, Mr. Lawrence Smethick, son of Colonel Smethick, M.P. of Pakethorpe Hall, Yorks, was arrested on the charge of having murdered Major Ceely on the night of December 24th, 25th, and after the usual magisterial inquiry was duly committed to stand his trial at the next York Assizes. I remember well that, throughout his preliminary ordeal, young Smethick bore himself like one who had given up all hope of refuting the terrible charges brought against him, and, I must say, the formidable number of witnesses which the police brought up against him more than explained that attitude. Of course, Haggett was not called, but as it happened, there were plenty of people to swear that Mr. Lawrence Smethick was seen loitering round the gates of Clevere Hall after the guests had departed on Christmas Eve. The head gardener, who lives at the lodge, actually spoke to him, and Captain Glynn, leaning out of his brougham, was heard to exclaim, "Hello, Smethick! What are you doing here at this time of night?" And there were others too. To Captain Glynn's credit, be it here recorded, he tried his best to deny having recognized his unfortunate friend in the dark. Pressed by the magistrate, he said obstinately, "I thought at the time that it was Mr. Smethick standing by the lodge gates, but on thinking the matter over, I feel sure that I was mistaken." On the other hand, what stood dead against young Smethick was, firstly, the question of the ring, and then the fact that he was seen in the immediate neighbourhood of Clevere, both at midnight and again at about 2, when some men, who had been on the watch for the cattle maimers, saw him walking away rapidly in the direction of Pakethorpe. What was, of course, unexplainable and very terrible to witness was Mr. Smethick's obstinate silence with regard to his own movements during those fatal hours on that night. He did not contradict those who said that they had seen him at or about midnight near the gates of Clevere, nor his own valet's statement as to the hour when he returned home. All he said was that he could not account for what he did between the time when the guests left the hall and he himself went back to Pakethorpe. He realized the danger in which he stood, and what caused him to be silent about a matter which might mean life or death to him could not be easily conjectured. The ownership of the ring he could not and did not dispute. He had lost it in the grounds of Clevere, he said, but the jeweller in Coney Street swore that he had sold the ring to Mr. Smethick on the 8th of December, whilst it was a well-known and an admitted fact that the young man had not openly been inside the gates of Clevere for over a fortnight before that. On this evidence Lawrence Smethick was committed for trial. Though the actual weapon with which the unfortunate major had been stabbed had not been found, nor its ownership traced, there was such a vast array of circumstantial evidence against the young man that bail was refused. He had, on the advice of his solicitor, Mr. Grayson, one of the ablest lawyers in York, reserved his defence, and on that miserable afternoon at the close of the year, we all filed out of the crowded court, feeling terribly depressed and anxious. A Christmas Tragedy, Part 4. My dear lady and I walked back to our hotel in silence. Our hearts seemed to weigh heavily within us. We felt mortally sorry for that good-looking young Yorkshireman, who, we were convinced, was innocent. yet at the same time seemed involved in a tangled web of deadly circumstances from which he seemed quite unable to extricate himself. We did not feel like discussing the matter in the open streets, neither did we make any comment when presently, in a block in the traffic in Coney Street, we saw Margaret Ceely driving her smart dog-cart, whilst sitting beside her, and talking with great earnestness close at her ear, sat Captain Glynn. She was in deep mourning, and had obviously been doing some shopping, for she was surrounded with parcels, so perhaps it was hypocritical to blame her. Yet somehow it struck me that just at the moment when there hung in the balance the life and honour of a man with whose name her own had oft been linked by popular rumour, it showed more than callous contempt for his welfare to be seen driving about with another man who, since his sudden access to fortune, had undoubtedly become a rival in her favours. When we arrived at the Black Swan, we were surprised to hear that Mr. Grayson had called to see my dear lady, and was upstairs waiting. Lady Molly ran up to our sitting-room and greeted him with marked cordiality. Mr. Grayson is an elderly, dry-looking man, but he looked visibly affected, and it was some time before he seemed able to plunge into the subject which had brought him hither. He fidgeted in his chair, and started talking about the weather. "I am not here in a strictly professional capacity, you know," said Lady Molly presently, with a kindly smile and with a view to helping him out of his embarrassment. "Our police, I fear me, have an exaggerated view of my capacities, and the men here have asked me unofficially to remain in the neighbourhood and give them my advice if they should require it. Our chief is very lenient to me, and has allowed me to stay. Therefore, if there is anything I can do—"
Indeed there is," ejaculated Mr. Grayson with sudden energy. "From all I hear, there is not another soul in the kingdom but you who can save this innocent man from the gallows."
My dear lady heaved a little sigh of satisfaction. She had all along wanted to have a more important finger in that Yorkshire pie. "Mr. Smethick?" she said.
"Yes, my unfortunate young client," replied the lawyer. "I may as well tell you," he resumed after a slight pause, during which he seemed to pull himself together, "as briefly as possible what occurred on December 24th last, and on the following Christmas morning. You will then understand the terrible plight in which my client finds himself, and how impossible it is for him to explain his actions on that eventful night. You will understand also why I have come to ask your help and your advice. Mr. Smethick considers himself engaged to Miss Ceely. The engagement had not been made public because of Major Ceely's anticipated opposition, but the young people had been very intimate, and many letters had passed between them. On the morning of the 24th, Mr. Smethick called at the Hall, his intention then being merely to present his fiancée with the ring you know of. You remember the unfortunate contretemps that occurred. I mean the unprovoked quarrel sought by Major Ceely with my poor client, ending with the irascible old man forbidding Mr. Smethick the house. My client walked out of Clevere feeling, as you might well imagine, very wrathful. On the doorstep, just as he was leaving, he met Miss Margaret, and told her very briefly what had occurred. She took the matter very lightly at first, but finally became more serious, and ended the brief interview with the request that, since he could not come to the dance, after what had occurred, he should come and see her afterwards, meeting her in the gardens soon after midnight. She would not take the ring from him then, but talked a good deal of sentiment about Christmas morning, asking him to bring the ring to her at night, and also the letters which she had written him. Well, you can guess the rest.
Lady Molly nodded thoughtfully.
Miss Ceely was playing a double game, continued Mr. Grayson earnestly. She was determined to break off all relationship with Mr. Smethick, for she had transferred her volatile affections to Captain Glynn, who had lately become heir to an earldom and £40,000 a year. Under the guise of sentimental twaddle, she got my unfortunate client to meet her at night in the grounds of Clevere, and to give up to her the letters which might have compromised her in the eyes of her new lover. At 2:00 a.m. Major Ceely was murdered by one of his numerous enemies, as to which I do not know, nor does Mr. Smethick. He had just parted from Miss Ceely at the very moment when the first cry of murder roused Clevere from its slumbers. This she could confirm if she only would, for the two were still in sight of each other, she inside the gates, he just a little way down the road. Mr. Smethick saw Margaret Ceely run rapidly back towards the house. He waited about a little while, half hesitating what to do. Then he reflected that his presence might be embarrassing, or even compromising to her whom, in spite of all, he still loved dearly, and knowing that there were plenty of men in and about the house to render what assistance was necessary, he finally turned his steps and went home, a broken-hearted man, since she had given him the go-by, taken her letters away, and flung contemptuously into the mud the ring he had bought for her. The lawyer paused, mopping his forehead and gazing with whole-souled earnestness at my lady's beautiful, thoughtful face. "Has Mr. Smethick spoken to Miss Ceely since?" asked Lady Molly after a while. "No, but I did," replied the lawyer. "What was her attitude?" "One of bitter and callous contempt. She denies my unfortunate client's story from beginning to end. Declares that she never saw him after she bade him good morning on the doorstep of Clevere Hall, when she heard of his unfortunate quarrel with her father. Nay, more, she scornfully calls the whole tale a cowardly attempt to shield a dastardly crime behind a still more dastardly libel on a defenceless girl." We were all silent now, buried in thought which none of us would have cared to translate into words. That the impasse seemed indeed hopeless, no one could deny. The tower of damning evidence against the unfortunate young man had indeed been built by remorseless circumstances with no faltering hand. Margaret Ceely alone could have saved him, but with brutal indifference she preferred the sacrifice of an innocent man's life and honour to that of her own chances of a brilliant marriage. There are such women in the world. Thank God, I have never met any but that one. Yet I am wrong when I say that she alone could save the unfortunate young man, who throughout was behaving with such consummate gallantry, refusing to give his own explanation of the events that occurred on that Christmas morning, unless she chose first to tell the tale. There was one present now in the dingy little room at the Black Swan who could disentangle that weird skein of coincidences, if any human being not gifted with miraculous powers could indeed do it at this 11th hour. She now said gently, "What would you like me to do in this matter, Mr. Grayson, and why have you come to me rather than to the police?" "How can I go with this tale to the police?" he ejaculated in obvious despair. "Would they not also look upon it as a dastardly libel on a woman's reputation? We have no proofs, remember, and Miss Ceely denies the whole story from first to last. No, no," he exclaimed with wonderful fervour. "I came to you because I have heard of your marvellous gifts, your extraordinary intuition. Someone murdered Major Ceely. It was not my old friend, Colonel Smethick's son. Find out who it was, then. I beg of you, find out who it was." He fell back in his chair, broken down with grief. With inexpressible gentleness, Lady Molly went up to him and placed her beautiful white hand on his shoulder. "I will do my best, Mr. Grayson," she said simply. A Christmas Tragedy, Part 5. We remained alone and singularly quiet the whole of that evening. That my dear lady's active brain was hard at work, I could guess by the brilliance of her eyes, and that sort of absolute stillness in her person through which one could almost feel the delicate nerves vibrating. The story told her by the lawyer had moved her singularly. Mind you, she had always been morally convinced of young Smethick's innocence, but in her the professional woman always fought hard battles against the sentimentalist, and in this instance the overwhelming circumstantial evidence and the conviction of her superiors had forced her to accept the young man's guilt as something out of her ken. By his silence, too, the young man had tacitly confessed, and if a man is perceived on the very scene of a crime, both before it has been committed and directly afterwards, if something admittedly belonging to him is found within 3 yards of where the murderer must have stood, if, added to this, he has had a bitter quarrel with the victim and can give no account of his actions or whereabouts during the fatal time, it were vain to cling to optimistic beliefs in that same man's innocence. But now matters had assumed an altogether different aspect. The story told by Mr. Smethick's lawyer had all the appearance of truth. Margaret Ceely's character, her callousness on the very day when her late fiancé stood in the dock, her quick transference of her affections to the richer man, all made the account of the events on Christmas night, as told by Mr. Grayson, extremely plausible.
No wonder my dear lady was buried in thought. "I shall have to take the threads up from the beginning, Mary," she said to me the following morning, when after breakfast she appeared in her neat coat and skirt, with hat and gloves, ready to go out. "So, on the whole, I think I will begin with a visit to the Haggetts." "I may come with you, I suppose?" I suggested meekly. "Oh, yes," she rejoined carelessly. Somehow I had an inkling that the carelessness of her mood was only on the surface. It was not likely that she, my sweet, womanly, ultra-feminine, beautiful lady, should feel callously on this absorbing subject. We motored down to Bishopthorpe. It was bitterly cold, raw, damp, and foggy. The chauffeur had some difficulty in finding the cottage, the home of the imbecile gardener and his wife. There was certainly not much look of home about the place. When, after much knocking at the door, Mrs. Haggett finally opened it, we saw before us one of the most miserable, slatternly places I think I ever saw. In reply to Lady Molly's somewhat curt inquiry, the woman said that Haggett was in bed, suffering from one of his fits. "That is a great pity," said my dear lady, rather unsympathetically, I thought, "for I must speak with him at once." "What is it about?" asked the woman sullenly. "I can take a message." "I am afraid not," rejoined my lady. "I was asked to see Haggett personally." "By whom, I'd like to know?" she retorted, now almost insolently. "I dare say you would. But you are wasting precious time. Hadn't you better help your husband on with his clothes? This lady and I will wait in the parlour." After some hesitation, the woman finally complied, looking very sulky the while. We went into the miserable little room wherein not only grinding poverty, but also untidiness and dirt were visible all round. We sat down on two of the cleanest-looking chairs, and waited whilst a colloquy in subdued voices went on in the room over our heads. The colloquy, I may say, seemed to consist of agitated whispers on the one part and wailing complaints on the other. This was followed presently by some thuds and much shuffling, and presently Haggett, looking uncared for, dirty and unkempt, entered the parlour, followed by his wife. He came forward, dragging his ill-shod feet and pulling nervously at his forelock. "Ah," said my lady kindly, "I am glad to see you down, Haggett, though I am afraid I haven't very good news for you." "Yes, miss," murmured the man, obviously not quite comprehending what was said to him. "I represent the workhouse authorities," continued Lady Molly, "and I thought we could arrange for you and your wife to come into the Union to-night, perhaps." "The Union?" here interposed the woman roughly. "What do you mean? We ain't going to the Union." "Well, but since you are not staying here," rejoined my lady blandly, "you will find it impossible to get another situation for your husband in his present mental condition." "Miss Ceely won't give us the go-by," she retorted defiantly. "She might wish to carry out her late father's intentions," said Lady Molly with seeming carelessness. "The Major was a cruel, cantankerous brute," shouted the woman, with unpremeditated violence. "Haggett had served him faithfully for 12 years and—" She checked herself abruptly and cast one of her quick, furtive glances at Lady Molly. Her silence now had become as significant as her outburst of rage, and it was Lady Molly who concluded the phrase for her. "And yet he dismissed him without warning," she said calmly. "Who told you that?" retorted the woman. "The same people, no doubt, who declare that you and Haggett had a grudge against the Major for this dismissal." "That's a lie," asserted Mrs. Haggett doggedly. "We gave information about Mr. Smethick having killed the Major because—" "Ah," interrupted Lady Molly quickly, "but then Mr. Smethick did not murder Major Ceely, and your information, therefore, was useless." "Then who killed the Major? I should like to know." Her manner was arrogant, coarse, and extremely unpleasant. I marvelled why my dear lady put up with it, and what was going on in that busy brain of hers. She looked quite urbane and smiling, whilst I wondered what in the world she meant by this story of the workhouse and the dismissal of Haggett. "Ah, that's what none of us know," she now said lightly. "Some folks say it was your husband." "They lie," she retorted quickly, whilst the imbecile, evidently not understanding the drift of the conversation, was mechanically stroking his red mop of hair and looking helplessly all round him. "He was home before the cries of murder were heard in the house," continued Mrs. Haggett. "How do you know?" asked Lady Molly quickly.
"How do I know?"
"Yes, you couldn't have heard the cries all the way to this cottage. Why, it's over half a mile from the Hall."
"He was home, I say," she repeated with dogged obstinacy.
"You sent him?"
"He didn't do it."
"No one will believe you, especially when the knife is found."
"What knife?"
"His clasp knife, with which he killed Major Ceely," said Lady Molly quietly. "See, he has it in his hand now." And with a sudden, wholly unexpected gesture she pointed to the imbecile, who in an aimless way had prowled round the room whilst this rapid colloquy was going on. The purport of it all must in some sort of way have found an echo in his enfeebled brain. He wandered up to the dresser, whereon lay the remnants of that morning's breakfast, together with some crockery and utensils. In that same half-witted and irresponsible way he had picked up one of the knives and was now holding it out towards his wife, whilst a look of fear spread over his countenance.
"I can't do it, Annie. I can't. You better do it," he said.
There was dead silence in the little room. The woman Haggett stood as if turned to stone. Ignorant and superstitious as she was, I suppose that the situation had laid hold of her nerves, and that she felt that the finger of a relentless fate was even now being pointed at her. The imbecile was shuffling forward, closer and closer to his wife, still holding out the knife towards her and murmuring brokenly, "I can't do it. You better, Annie. You better." He was close to her now, and all at once her rigidity and nerve strain gave way. She gave a hoarse cry, and snatching the knife from the poor wretch, she rushed at him, ready to strike. Lady Molly and I were both young, active, and strong, and there was nothing of this squeamish grande dame about my dear lady when quick action was needed. But even then we had some difficulty in dragging Annie Haggett away from her miserable husband. Blinded with fury, she was ready to kill the man who had betrayed her. Finally, we succeeded in wresting the knife from her. You may be sure that it required some pluck after that to sit down again quietly and to remain in the same room with this woman, who already had one crime upon her conscience, and with this weird, half-witted creature who kept on murmuring pitiably, "You'd better do it, Annie." Well, you've read the account of the case, so you know what followed. Lady Molly did not move from that room until she had obtained the woman's full confession. All she did for her own protection was to order me to open the window and to blow the police whistle which she handed to me. The police station, fortunately, was not very far, and sound carried in the frosty air. She admitted to me afterwards that it had been foolish, perhaps, not to have brought Etty or Danvers with her, but she was supremely anxious not to put the woman on the alert from the very start. Hence her circumlocutory speeches anent the workhouse and Haggett's probable dismissal. That the woman had some connection with the crime, Lady Molly, with her keen intuition, had always felt, but as there was no witness to the murder itself, and all circumstantial evidence was dead against young Smethick, there was only one chance of successful discovery, and that was the murderer's own confession. If you think over the interview between my dear lady and the Haggetts on that memorable morning, you will realize how admirably Lady Molly had led up to the weird finish. She would not speak to the woman unless Haggett was present, and she felt sure that as soon as the subject of the murder cropped up, the imbecile would either do or say something that would reveal the truth. Mechanically, when Major Ceely's name was mentioned, he had taken up the knife. The whole scene recurred to his tottering mind. That the Major had summarily dismissed him recently was one of those bold guesses which Lady Molly was wont to make. That Haggett had been merely egged on by his wife, and had been too terrified at the last to do the deed himself, was no surprise to her, and hardly one to me, whilst the fact that the woman ultimately wreaked her own passionate revenge upon the unfortunate Major was hardly to be wondered at, in the face of her own coarse and elemental personality. Cowed by the quickness of events, and by the appearance of Danvers and Etty on the scene, she finally made full confession. She was maddened by the Major's brutality, when with rough, cruel words he suddenly turned her husband adrift, refusing to give him further employment. She herself had great ascendancy over the imbecile, and had drilled into him a part of hate and of revenge. At first he seemed ready and willing to obey. It was arranged that he was to watch on the terrace every night until such time as an alarm of the recurrence of the cattle-maiming outrages should lure the Major out alone. This effectively occurred on Christmas morning, but not before Haggett, frightened and pusillanimous, was ready to flee rather than to accomplish the villainous deed. But Annie Haggett, guessing perhaps that he would shrink from the crime at the last, had also kept watch every night. Picture the prospective murderer watching and being watched. When Haggett came across his wife, he deputed her to do the deed herself. I suppose that either terror of discovery or merely desire for the promised reward had caused the woman to fasten the crime on another. The finding of the ring by Haggett was the beginning of that cruel thought which, but for my dear lady's marvellous powers, would indeed have sent a brave young man to the gallows. Ah, you wish to know if Margaret Ceely is married? No! Captain Glynn cried off. What suspicions crossed his mind I cannot say, but he never proposed to Margaret, and now she is in Australia, staying with an aunt, I think, and she has sold Clevere Hall. End of Part 5 of A Christmas Tragedy. Chapter 8, Part 1 of Lady Molly of Scotland Yard, by Baroness Orczy. The Bag of Sand, Part 1. Of course, I knew at once by the expression of her face that morning that my dear lady had some important business on hand. She had a bundle in her arms, consisting of a shabby-looking coat and skirt, and a very dowdy hat trimmed with bunches of cheap calico roses. "Put these things on at once, Mary," she said curtly, "for you are going to apply for the situation of good plain cook, so mind you look the part." "But where in the world?" I gasped in astonishment. "In the house of Mr. Nicholas Jones in Eaton Terrace," she interrupted dryly, "the one occupied until recently by his sister, the late Mrs. Dunstan. Mrs. Jones is advertising for a cook, and you must get that place." As you know, I have carried obedience to the level of a fine art, nor was I altogether astonished that my dear lady had at last been asked to put one of her dainty fingers in that Dunstan pie, which was puzzling our fellows more completely than any other case I have ever known. I don't know if you remember the many circumstances, the various contradictions which were cropping up at every turn, and which baffled our ablest detectives at the very moment when they thought themselves most near the solution of that strange mystery. Mrs. Dunstan herself was a very uninteresting individual, self-righteous, self-conscious, and fat, a perfect type of the moneyed middle-class woman whose balance at the local bank is invariably heavier than that of her neighbours. Her niece, Violet Frostwick, lived with her, a smart, pretty girl, inordinately fond of dainty clothes and other luxuries which money can give. Being totally impecunious herself, she bore with the older woman's constant varying caprices with almost angelic patience, a fact probably attributable to Mrs. Dunstan's testamentary intentions, which, as she often averred, were in favour of her niece. In addition to these two ladies, the household consisted of 3 servants and Miss Cruikshank. The latter was a quiet, unassuming girl, who was by way of being secretary and lady help to Mrs. Dunstan, but who, in reality, was nothing but a willing drudge. Up betimes in the morning, she combined the work of a housekeeper with that of an upper servant. She interviewed the tradespeople, kept the servants in order, and ironed and smartened up Miss Violet's blouses, a Cinderella, in fact. Mrs. Dunstan kept a cook and 2 maids, all of whom had been with her for years. In addition to these, a charwoman came very early in the morning to light fires, clean boots, and do the front steps. On November 22, 1907, for the early history of this curious drama dates back to that year, the charwoman who had been employed at Mrs. Dunstan's house in Eaton Terrace for some considerable time sent word in the morning that in future she would be unable to come. Her husband had been obliged to move to lodgings nearer to his work, and she herself could not undertake to come the greater distance at the early hour at which Mrs. Dunstan required her. The woman had written a very nice letter explaining these facts, and sent it by hand, stating at the same time that the bearer of the note was a very respectable woman, a friend of her own, who would be very pleased to oblige Mrs. Dunstan by taking on the morning's work. I must tell you that the message and its bearer arrived at Eaton Terrace somewhere about 6 a.m., when no one was down except the Cinderella of the house, Miss Cruikshank. She saw the woman, liked her appearance, and then engaged her to do the work, subject to Mrs. Dunstan's approval. The woman, who had given her name as Mrs. Thomas, seemed very quiet and respectable. She said that she lived close by, in St. Peter's Mews, and therefore could come as early as Mrs. Dunstan wished. In fact, from that day she came every morning at 5:30 a.m., and by 7 o'clock had finished her work and was able to go home. If, in addition to these details, I tell you that, at the time, pretty Miss Violet Frostwicke was engaged to a young Scotsman, Mr. David Athol, of whom her aunt totally disapproved, I shall have put before you all the personages who, directly or indirectly, were connected with that drama, the final act of which has not yet been witnessed either by the police or by the public. The Bag of Sand, Part 2. On the following New Year's Eve, Mrs. Dunstan, as was her invariable custom on that day, went to her married brother's house to dine and see the New Year in. During her absence, the usual thing occurred at Eaton Terrace. Miss Violet Frostwicke took the opportunity of inviting Mr. David Athol to spend the evening with her. Mrs. Dunstan's servants, mind you, all knew of the engagement between the young people, and with the characteristic sentimentality of their class, connived at these secret meetings and helped to hoodwink the irascible old aunt. Mr. Athol was a good-looking young man, whose chief demerit lay in his total lack of money or prospects. Also, he was by way of being an actor, another deadly sin in the eyes of the puritanically minded old lady. Already, on more than one occasion, there had been vigorous wordy wordfare twixt Mr. Athol and Mrs. Dunstan, and the latter had declared that if Violet chose to take up with this mountebank, she should never see a penny of her aunt's money now or in the future. The young man did not come very often to Eaton Terrace, but on this festive New Year's Eve, when Mrs. Dunstan was not expected to be home until long after midnight, it seemed too splendid an opportunity for an ardent lover to miss. As ill luck would have it, Mrs. Dunstan had not felt very well after her copious dinner, and her brother, Mr. Nicholas Jones, escorted her home soon after 10 o'clock. Jane, the parlour-maid, who opened the front door, was, in her own graphic language, knocked all of a heap when she saw her mistress, knowing full well that Mr. Athol was still in the dining-room with Miss Violet, and that Miss Cruikshank was at that very moment busy getting him a whisky and soda. Meanwhile, the coat and hat in the hall had revealed the young man's presence in the house. For a moment Mrs. Dunstan paused, whilst Jane stood trembling with fright. Then the old lady turned to Mr. Nicholas Jones, who was still standing on the doorstep, and said quietly, "Will you telephone over to Mr. Blenkinsop, Nick, the first thing in the morning, and tell him I'll be at his office by 10 o'clock?" Mr. Blenkinsop was Mrs. Dunstan's solicitor, and, as Jane explained to the cook later on, what could such an appointment mean but a determination to cut Miss Violet out of the missis's will with the proverbial shilling? After this Mrs. Dunstan took leave of her brother and went straight into the dining-room. According to the subsequent testimony of all three servants, the mistress went on dreadful. Words were not easily distinguishable from behind the closed door, but it seems that, immediately she entered, Mrs. Dunstan's voice was raised as if in terrible anger, and a few moments later Miss Violet fled crying from the dining-room and ran quickly upstairs. Whilst the door was thus momentarily opened and shut, the voice of the old lady was heard saying, in majestic wrath, "That's what you have done. Get out of this house. As for her, she'll never see a penny of my money, and she may starve for aught I care." The quarrel seems to have continued for a short while after that, the servants being too deeply awed by those last vindictive words which they had heard to take much note of what went on subsequently. Mrs. Dunstan and Mr. Athol were closeted together for some time, but apparently the old lady's wrath did not subside, for when she marched up to bed an hour later she was heard to say, "Out of this house she shall go, and the first thing in the morning, too. I'll have no goings-on with a mountebank like you." Miss Cruikshank was terribly upset. "It is a frightful blow for Miss Violet," she said to cook, "but perhaps Mrs. Dunstan will feel more forgiving in the morning. I'll take her up a glass of champagne now. She is very fond of that, and it will help her to get to sleep." Miss Cruikshank went up with the champagne, and told cook to see Mr. Athol out of the house, but the young man, who seemed very anxious and agitated, would not go away immediately. He stayed in the dining-room, smoking, for a while, and when the two younger servants went up to bed, he asked cook to let him remain until he had seen Miss Violet once more, for he was sure she would come down again, he had asked Miss Cruikshank to beg her to do so. Mrs. Kennett, the cook, was a kind-hearted old woman. She had taken the young people under her special protection, and felt very vexed that the course of true love should not be allowed to run quite smoothly. So she told Mr. Athol to make himself happy and comfortable in the dining-room, and she would sit up by the fire in the library until he was ready to go. The good soul thereupon made up a fire in the library, drew up a chair in front of it, and went fast to sleep. Suddenly something awoke her. She sat up and looked round in that dazed manner peculiar to people just aroused from deep sleep. She looked at the clock. It was past 3. Surely, she thought, it must have been Mr. Athol calling to her which had caused her to wake. She went into the hall, where the gas had not yet been turned off, and there she saw Miss Violet, fully dressed and wearing a hat and coat, in the very act of going out at the front door. In the cook's own words, before she could ask a question or even utter a sound, the young girl had opened the front door, which was still on the latch, and then banged it to again, she herself having disappeared into the darkness of the street beyond. Mrs. Kennett ran to the door and out into the street as fast as her old legs would let her, but the night was an exceptionally foggy one. Violet, no doubt, had walked rapidly away, and there came no answer to Mrs. Kennett's repeated calls. Thoroughly upset, and not knowing what to do, the good woman went back into the house. Mr. Athol had evidently left, for there was no sign of him in the dining-room or elsewhere. She then went upstairs and knocked at Mrs. Dunstan's door. To her astonishment, the gas was still burning in her mistress's room, as she could see a thin ray of light filtering through the keyhole. At her first knock there came a quick, impatient answer. "What is it?" "Miss Violet, said the cook, who was too agitated to speak very coherently. "She's gone." "The best thing she could do," came promptly from the other side of the door. "You go to bed, Mrs. Kennett, and don't worry." Whereupon the gas was suddenly turned off inside the room, and, in spite of Mrs. Kennett's further feeble protests, no other word issued from the room save another impatient "Go to bed." The cook then did as she was bid, but before going to bed she made the round of the house, turned off all the gas, and finally bolted the front door. The Bag of Sand, Part 3. Some 3 hours later the servants were called as usual by Miss Cruikshank, who then went down to open the area door to Mrs. Thomas, the charwoman. At 6:30, when Mary the housemaid came down, candle in hand, she saw the charwoman a flight or 2 lower down, also apparently in the act of going downstairs. This astonished Mary not a little, as the woman's work lay entirely in the basement, and she was supposed never to come to the upper floors. The woman, though walking rapidly down the stairs, seemed, moreover, to be carrying something heavy. "Anything wrong, Mrs. Thomas?" asked Mary in a whisper. The woman looked up, pausing a moment immediately under the gas bracket, the bypass of which shed a feeble light upon her and her burden. The latter Mary recognized as the bag containing the sand which, on frosty mornings, had to be strewn on the front steps of the house. On the whole, though she certainly was puzzled, Mary did not think very much about the incident then. As was her custom, she went into the housemaid's closet, got the hot water for Miss Cruikshank's bath, and carried it to the latter's room, where she also pulled up the blinds and got things ready generally, for Miss Cruikshank usually ran down in her dressing-gown and came up to tidy herself later on. As a rule, by the time the 3 servants got downstairs it was nearly 7, and Mrs. Thomas had generally gone by that time. But on this occasion Mary was earlier. Miss Cruikshank was busy in the kitchen, getting Mrs. Dunstan's tea ready. Mary spoke about seeing Mrs. Thomas on the stairs with the bag of sand, and Miss Cruikshank, too, was very astonished at the occurrence. Mrs. Kennett was not yet down, and the charwoman apparently had gone. Her work had been done as usual, and the sand was strewn over the stone steps in front, as the frosty fog had rendered them very slippery. At 7:15, Miss Cruikshank went up with Mrs. Dunstan's tea, and less than 2 minutes later a fearful scream rang through the entire house, followed by the noise of breaking crockery. In an instant the 2 maids ran upstairs, straight to Mrs. Dunstan's room, the door of which stood wide open. The first thing Mary and Jane were conscious of was a terrific smell of gas, then of Miss Cruikshank, with eyes dilated with horror, staring at the bed in front of her, whereon lay Mrs. Dunstan, with one end of a piece of india-rubber piping still resting in her mouth, her jaw having dropped in death. The other end of that piece of piping was attached to the burner of a gas bracket on the wall close by. Every window in the room was fastened and the curtains drawn. The whole room reeked of gas. Mrs. Dunstan had been asphyxiated by its fumes. The Bag of Sand, Part 4. A year went by after the discovery of the mysterious tragedy, and I can assure you that our fellows at the Yard had one of the toughest jobs in connection with the case that ever fell to their lot. Just think of all the contradictions which met them at every turn. Firstly, the disappearance of Miss Violet. No sooner had the women in the Dunstan household roused themselves sufficiently from their horror at the terrible discovery which they had just made, than they were confronted with another almost equally awful fact, awful, of course, because of its connection with the primary tragedy. Miss Violet Frostwicke had gone. Her room was empty. Her bed had not been slept in. She herself had been seen by the cook, Mrs. Kennett, stealing out of the house at the dead of night. To connect the pretty, dainty young girl even remotely with a crime so hideous, so callous, as the deliberate murder of an old woman who had been as a mother to her, seemed absolutely out of the question. And by tacit consent the four women, who now remained in the desolate and gloom-laden house at Eaton Terrace, forbore to mention Miss Violet Frostwicke's name either to police or doctor. Both of these, of course, had been summoned immediately, Miss Cruikshank sending Mary to the police station and thence to Dr. Folwell in Eaton Square, whilst Jane went off in a cab to fetch Mr. Nicholas Jones, who, fortunately, had not yet left for his place of business. The doctors and the police inspector's first thought, on examining the mise en scène of the terrible tragedy, was that Mrs. Dunstan had committed suicide. It was practically impossible to imagine that a woman in full possession of health and strength would allow a piece of india-rubber piping to be fixed between her teeth, and would, without a struggle, continue to inhale the poisonous fumes which would mean certain death. Yet there were no marks of injury upon the body, nothing to show how sufficient unconsciousness had been produced in the victim to permit the miscreant completing his awesome deed. But the theory of suicide set up by Dr. Folwell was promptly refuted by the most cursory examination of the room. Though the drawers were found closed, they had obviously been turned over, as if the murderer had been in search either of money or papers, or the key of the safe. The latter, on investigation, was found to be open, whilst the key lay on the floor close by. A brief examination of the safe revealed the fact that the tin boxes must have been ransacked, for they contained neither money nor important papers now, whilst the gold and platinum settings of necklaces, bracelets, and a tiara showed that the stones, which, as Mr. Nicholas Jones subsequently averred, were of considerable value, had been carefully, if somewhat clumsily, taken out by obvious, inexperienced hands. On the whole, therefore, appearances suggested deliberate, systematic, and very leisurely robbery, which wholly contradicted the theory of suicide. Then, suddenly, the name of Miss Frostwicke was mentioned. Who first brought it on the tapis, no one subsequently could say, but in a moment the whole story of the young girl's engagement to Mr. Athol, in defiance of her aunt's wishes, the quarrel of the night before, and the final disappearance of both young people from the house during the small hours of the morning, was dragged from the four unwilling witnesses by the able police inspector. Nay, more. One very unpleasant little circumstance was detailed by one of the maids and corroborated by Miss Cruikshank. It seems that when the latter took up the champagne to Mrs. Dunstan, the old lady desired Miss Violet to come to her room. Mary, the housemaid, was on the stairs when she saw the young girl, still dressed in her evening gown of white chiffon, her eyes still swollen with tears, knocking at her aunt's door. The police inspector was busy taking notes, already building up in his mind a simple, if very sensational, case against Violet Frostwicke, when Mrs. Kennett promptly upset all his calculations. Miss Violet could have had nothing to do with the murder of her aunt, seeing that Miss Dunstan was alive and actually spoke to the cook when the latter knocked at her bedroom door after she had seen the young girl walk out of the house. Then came the question of Mr. Athol, but, if you remember, it was quite impossible even to begin to build up a case against the young man. His own statement that he left the house at about midnight, having totally forgotten to rouse the cook when he did so, was amply corroborated from every side. The cabman who took him up to the corner of Eaton Terrace at 11:50 p.m. was one witness in his favour. His landlady at his rooms in Jermyn Street, who let him in since he had mislaid his latchkey, and who took him up some tea at 7 o'clock the next morning, was another. Whilst, when Mary saw Miss Violet going into her aunt's room, the clock at St. Peter's, Eaton Square, was just striking 12. I dare say you think I ought by now to have mentioned the charwoman, Mrs. Thomas, who represented the final, most complete, most hopeless contradiction in this remarkable case. Mrs. Thomas was seen by Mary, the housemaid, at 6:30 in the morning, coming down from the upper floors, where she had no business to be, and carrying the bag of sand used for strewing over the slippery front door steps. The bag of sand, of course, was always kept in the area. The moment that the bag of sand was mentioned, Dr. Folwell gave a curious gasp. Here, at least, was the solution to one mystery. The victim had been stunned while still in bed, by a blow on the head dealt with that bag of sand, and while she was unconscious, the callous miscreant had robbed her and finally asphyxiated her with the gas fumes. Where was the woman who, at 6:30 in the morning, was seen in possession of the silent instrument of death? Mrs. Thomas had disappeared. The last that was then, or ever has been seen of her, was when she passed underneath the dim light of a bypass on the landing, as if tired out with the weight which she was carrying. Since then, as you know, the police have been unswerving in their efforts to find Mrs. Thomas. The address which she had given in St. Peter's Mews was found to be false. No one of that name or appearance had ever been seen there. The woman who was supposed to have sent her with a letter of recommendation to Mrs. Dunstan knew nothing of her. She swore that she had never sent anyone with a letter to Mrs. Dunstan. She gave up her work there one day because she found it too hard at such an early hour in the morning, but she never heard anything more from her late employer after that. Strange, wasn't it, that two people should have disappeared out of that house on the same memorable night? Of course you will remember the tremendous sensation that was caused some 24 hours later, when it transpired that the young person who had thrown herself into the river from Waterloo Bridge on that same eventful morning, and whose body was subsequently recovered and conveyed to the Thames police station, was identified as Miss Violet Frostwicke, the niece of the lady who had been murdered in her own house in Eaton Terrace. Neither money nor diamonds were found on poor Miss Violet. She had herself given the most complete proof that she, at least, had no hand in robbing or killing Mrs. Dunstan. The public wondered why she took her aunt's wrath and her probable disinheritance so fearfully to heart, and sympathized with Mr. David Athol for the terribly sad loss which he had sustained. But Mrs. Thomas, the charwoman, had not yet been found. The Bag of Sand, Part 5. I think I looked an extremely respectable, good plain cook when I presented myself at the house in Eaton Terrace in response to the advertisement in the Daily Telegraph. As, in addition to my prepossessing appearance, I also asked very low wages, and declared myself ready to do anything except scour the front steps and the stone area, I was immediately engaged by Mrs. Jones, and was duly installed in the house the following day under the name of Mrs. Curwen. But few events had occurred here since the discovery of the dual tragedy, now more than a year ago, and none that had thrown any light upon the mystery which surrounded it. The verdict at the inquest had been one of wilful murder against a person known as Mrs. Thomas, the weight of evidence, coupled with her disappearance, having been very heavy against her, and there was a warrant out for her arrest. Mrs. Dunstan had died intestate. To the astonishment of all those in the know, she had never signed the will which Messrs. Blenkinsop and Blenkinsop had drafted for her, and wherein she bequeathed £20,000 and the lease of her house in Eaton Terrace to her beloved niece Violet Frostwicke, £1,000 to Miss Cruikshank, and other smaller legacies to friends or servants. In default of a will, Mr. Nicholas Jones, only brother of the deceased, became possessed of all her wealth. He was a very rich man himself, and many people thought that he ought to give Miss Cruikshank the £1,000 which the girl had thus lost through no fault of her own. What his ultimate intentions were with regard to this no one could know. For the present he contented himself with moving to Eaton Terrace with his family, and as his wife was a great invalid, he asked Miss Cruikshank to continue to make her home in the house and to help in its management. Neither the diamonds nor the money stolen from Mrs. Dunstan's safe were ever traced. It seems that Mrs. Dunstan, a day or two before her death, had sold a freehold cottage which she owned near Teddington. The money, as is customary, had been handed over to her in gold, in Mr. Blenkinsop's office, and she had been foolish enough not to bank it immediately. This money and the diamonds had been the chief spoils of her assailant, and all the while no trace of Mrs. Thomas, in spite of the most strenuous efforts on the part of the police to find her. Strangely enough, when I had been in Eaton Terrace about 3 days, and was already getting very tired of early rising and hard work, the charwoman there fell ill one day, and did not come to her work as usual. I, of course, grumbled like 6, for I had to be on my hands and knees the next morning scrubbing stone steps, and my thoughts of Lady Molly for the moment were not quite as loyal as they usually were. Suddenly I heard a shuffling footstep close behind me. I turned and saw a rough-looking, ill-dressed woman standing at the bottom of the steps. "What do you want?" I asked sourly, for I was in a very bad humour. "I saw you scrubbing them steps, miss," she said in a very raucous voice. "My husband's out of work, and the children ain't had no breakfast this morning. I do them steps, miss, if you give me a trifle." The woman certainly did not look very prepossessing, with her shabby, broad-brimmed hat hiding the upper part of her face, and her skirt, torn and muddy, pinned up untidily round her stooping figure. However, I did not think that I could be doing anything very wrong by letting her do this one bit of rough work, which I hated, so I agreed to give her 6pence, and left her there with kneeling mat and scrubbing brush, and went in, leaving, however, the front door open. In the hall I met Miss Cruikshank, who, as usual, was down before everybody else. "What is it, Curwen?" she asked, for through the open door she had caught sight of the woman kneeling on the step. "A woman, miss," I replied somewhat curtly. "She offered to do the steps. I thought Mrs. Jones wouldn't mind, as Mrs. Callahan hasn't turned up." Miss Cruikshank hesitated an instant, and then walked up to the front door. At the same moment the woman looked up, rose from her knees, and boldly went up to accost Miss Cruikshank. "You'll remember me, miss," she said in her raucous voice. "I used to work for Mrs. Dunstan once. My name is Mrs. Thomas." No wonder Miss Cruikshank uttered a quickly smothered cry of horror. Thinking that she would faint, I ran to her assistance, but she waved me aside and then said quite quietly, "This poor woman's mind is deranged. She is no more Mrs. Thomas than I am. Perhaps we had better send for the police." "Yes, miss, perhaps you'd better," said the woman with a sigh. "My secrets has been weighing heavy on me of late." "But, my good woman," said Miss Cruikshank very kindly, for I suppose that she thought, as I did, that this was one of those singular cases of madness which sometimes cause innocent people to accuse themselves of undiscovered crimes. "You are not Mrs. Thomas at all. I knew Mrs. Thomas well, of course, and—" "Of course you knew me, miss," replied the woman. "The last conversation you and I had together was in the kitchen that morning, when Mrs. Dunstan was killed. I remember your saying to me—" "Fetch the police, Curwen," said Miss Cruikshank peremptorily, whereupon the woman broke into a harsh, loud laugh of defiance. To tell you the truth, I was not a little puzzled. That this scene had been foreseen by my dear lady, and that she had sent me to this house on purpose that I should witness it, I was absolutely convinced. But here was my dilemma. Ought I to warn the police at once or not? On the whole, I decided that my best plan would undoubtedly be to communicate with Lady Molly first of all, and to await her instructions. So I ran upstairs, scribbled a hasty note to my dear lady, and in response to Miss Cruikshank's orders, flew out of the house through the area gate, noticing, as I did so, that Miss Cruikshank was still parleying with the woman on the doorstep. I sent the note off to Maida Vale by taxicab. Then I went back to Eaton Terrace. Miss Cruikshank met me at the front door and told me that she had tried to detain the woman, pending my return, but that she felt very sorry for the unfortunate creature, who obviously was labouring under a delusion, and she had allowed her to go away. About an hour later I received a curt note from Lady Molly ordering me to do nothing whatever without her special authorization. In the course of the day Miss Cruikshank told me that she had been to the police station and had consulted with the inspector, who said that there would be no harm in engaging the pseudo Mrs. Thomas to work at Eaton Terrace, especially as thus she would remain under observation. Then followed a curious era in Mr. Nicholas Jones's otherwise well-ordered household. We 3 servants, instead of being called at 6 as heretofore, were allowed to sleep on until 7. When we came down we were not scolded. On the contrary, we found our work already done. The charwoman, whoever she was, must have been a very hard-working woman. It was marvellous what she accomplished single-handed before 7 a.m., by which time she had invariably gone. The 2 maids, of course, were content to let this pleasant state of things go on, but I was devoured with curiosity. One morning I crept quietly downstairs and went into the kitchen soon after 6. I found the pseudo-Mrs. Thomas sitting at a very copious breakfast. I noticed that she had on altogether different, though equally shabby and dirty, clothes from those she had worn when she first appeared on the doorstep of 180 Eaton Terrace. Near her plate were 3 or 4 golden sovereigns, over which she had thrown her grimy hand. Miss Cruikshank, the while, was on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor. At sight of me she jumped up, and with obvious confusion muttered something about hating to be idle, etc. That day Miss Cruikshank told me that I did not suit Mrs. Jones, who wished me to leave at the end of my month. In the afternoon I received a little note from my dear lady, telling me to be downstairs by 6 o'clock the following morning. I did as I was ordered, of course, and when I came into the kitchen punctually at 6 a.m. I found the charwoman sitting at the table with a pile of gold in front of her, which she was counting over with a very grubby finger. She had her back to me, and was saying as I entered, "I think if you was to give me another 50 quid, I'd leave you the rest now. You'd still have the diamonds and the rest of the money." She spoke to Miss Cruikshank, who was facing me, and who, on seeing me appear, turned as white as a ghost. But she quickly recovered herself, and standing between me and the woman, she said vehemently, "What do you mean by prying on me like this? Go and pack your boxes and leave the house this instant." But before I could reply, the woman interposed. "Don't fret yourself, miss," she said, placing her grimy hand on Miss Cruikshank's shoulder. "There's the bag of sand in that there corner. We'll knock her down as we did Mrs. Dunstan, eh?" "Hold your tongue, you lying fool," said the girl, who now looked like a maddened fury. "Give me that other 50 quid, and I'll hold my tongue," retorted the woman boldly. "This creature is mad," said Miss Cruikshank, who had made a vigorous and successful effort to recover herself. "She is under the delusion that not only is she Mrs. Thomas, but that she murdered Mrs. Dunstan." "No, no," interrupted the woman. "I only came back that morning because I recollected that you had left the bag of sand upstairs after you so cleverly did away with Mrs. Dunstan, robbed her of all her money and jewels, and even was sharp enough to imitate her voice when Mrs. Kennett, the cook, terrified you by speaking to Mrs. Dunstan through the door. It is false. You are not Mrs. Thomas. The 2 maids who are here now, and who were in this house at that time, can swear that you are a liar." "Let us change clothes now, Miss Cruikshank," said a voice, which sounded almost weirdly in my ear in spite of its familiarity, for I could not locate whence it came, "and see if in a charwoman's dress those 2 maids will not recognize you. Mary," continued the same familiar voice, "help me out of these filthy clothes. Perhaps Miss Cruikshank would like to resume her own part of Mrs. Thomas, the charwoman." "Liars and impostors both!" shouted the girl, who was rapidly losing all presence of mind. "I'll send for the police." "Quite unnecessary," rejoined Lady Molly coolly. "Detective Inspector Danvers is just outside that door." The girl made a dash for the other door, but I was too quick for her and held her back, even whilst Lady Molly gave a short, sharp call which brought Danvers on the scene. I must say that Miss Cruikshank made a bold fight, but Danvers had 2 of our fellows with him, and arrested her on the warrant for the apprehension of the person known as Mrs. Thomas. The clothes of the charwoman who had so mysteriously disappeared had been found by Lady Molly at the back of the coal cellar, and she was still dressed in them at the present moment. No wonder I had not recognized my own dainty lady in the grimy woman who had so successfully played the part of a blackmailer on the murderess of Mrs. Dunstan. She explained to me subsequently that the first inkling that she had had of the horrible truth, namely, that it was Miss Cruikshank who had deliberately planned to murder Mrs. Dunstan by impersonating a charwoman for a while, and thus throwing dust in the eyes of the police, was when she heard of the callous words which the old lady was supposed to have uttered when she was told of Miss Violet's flight from the house in the middle of the night. "She may have been angry at the girl's escapade," explained Lady Molly to me, "but she would not have allowed her to starve. Such cruelty was all out of proportions to the offence. Then I looked about me for a stronger motive for the old woman's wrath, and remembering what she said on New Year's Eve, when Violet fled crying from the room, I came to the conclusion that her anger was not directed against her niece, but against the other girl, and against the man who had transferred his affections from Violet Frostwicke to Miss Cruikshank, and had not only irritated Mrs. Dunstan by this clandestine, double-faced love-making, but had broken the heart of his trusting fiancée. No doubt Miss Cruikshank did not know that the will,
whereby she was to inherit £1,000, was not signed, and no doubt she and young Athol planned out that cruel murder between them. The charwoman was also a bag of sand, which was literally thrown into the eyes of the police. But, I objected, I can't understand how a cold-blooded creature like that Miss Cruikshank could have allowed herself to be terrorized and blackmailed. She knew that you could not be Mrs. Thomas, since Mrs. Thomas never existed. Yes, but one must reckon a little sometimes with that negligible quantity known as conscience. My appearance as Mrs. Thomas vaguely frightened Miss Cruikshank. She wondered who I was and what I knew. When, 3 days later, I found the shabby clothes in the coal cellar, and appeared dressed in them, she lost her head. She gave me money. From that moment she was done for. Confession was only a matter of time. And Miss Cruikshank did make full confession. She was recommended to mercy on account of her sex, but she was plucky enough not to implicate David Athol in the recital of her crime. He has since emigrated to Western Canada. End of The Bag of Sand. Chapter 9, Part 1 of Lady Molly of Scotland Yard, by Baroness Orczy. The Man in the Inverness Cape, Part 1. I have heard many people say, people too, mind you, who read their daily paper regularly, that it is quite impossible for anyone to disappear within the confines of the British Isles. At the same time, these wise people invariably admit one great exception to their otherwise unimpeachable theory, and that is the case of Mr. Leonard Marvell, who, as you know, walked out one afternoon from the Scotia Hotel in Cromwell Road, and has never been seen or heard of since. Information had originally been given to the police by Mr. Marvell's sister Olive, a Scotchwoman of the usually accepted type, tall, bony, with sandy-coloured hair, and a somewhat melancholy expression in her blue-grey eyes. Her brother, she said, had gone out on a rather foggy afternoon. I think it was the 3rd of February, just about a year ago. His intention had been to go and consult a solicitor in the city, whose address had been given him recently by a friend, about some private business of his own. Mr. Marvell had told his sister that he would get a train at South Kensington Station to Moorgate Street, and walk thence to Finsbury Square. She was to expect him home by dinner-time. As he was, however, very irregular in his habits, being fond of spending his evenings at restaurants and music-halls, the sister did not feel the least anxious when he did not return home at the appointed time. She had her dinner in the table d'hôte room, and went to bed soon after 10 o'clock. She and her brother occupied 2 bedrooms and a sitting-room on the 2nd floor of the little private hotel. Miss Marvell, moreover, had a maid always with her, as she was somewhat of an invalid. This girl, Rosie Campbell, a nice-looking Scotch lassie, slept on the top floor. It was only on the following morning, when Mr. Leonard did not put in an appearance at breakfast, that Miss Marvell began to feel anxious. According to her own account, she sent Rosie in to see if anything was the matter, and the girl, wide-eyed and not a little frightened, came back with the news that Mr. Marvell was not in his room, and that his bed had not been slept in that night. With characteristic Scottish reserve, Miss Olive said nothing about the matter at the time to anyone, nor did she give information to the police until 2 days later, when she herself had exhausted every means in her power to discover her brother's whereabouts. She had seen the lawyer to whose office Leonard Marvell had intended going that afternoon, but Mr. Statham, the solicitor in question, had seen nothing of the missing man. With great adroitness, Rosie, the maid, had made inquiries at South Kensington and Moorgate Street stations. At the former, the booking clerk, who knew Mr. Marvell by sight, distinctly remembered selling him a first-class ticket to one of the city stations in the early part of the afternoon. But at Moorgate Street, which is a very busy station, no one recollected seeing a tall, red-haired Scotchman in an Inverness cape. Such was the description given of the missing man. By that time the fog had become very thick in the city, traffic was disorganized, and everyone felt fussy, ill-tempered, and self-centred. These, in substance, were the details which Miss Marvell gave to the police on the subject of her brother's strange disappearance. At first she did not appear very anxious. She seemed to have great faith in Mr. Marvell's power to look after himself. Moreover, she declared positively that her brother had neither valuables nor money about his person when he went out that afternoon. But as day succeeded day, and no trace of the missing man had yet been found, matters became more serious, and the search instituted by our fellows at the Yard waxed more keen.
A description of Mr. Leonard Marvell was published in the leading London and provincial dailies. Unfortunately, there was no good photograph of him extant, and descriptions are apt to prove vague. Very little was known about the man beyond his disappearance, which had rendered him famous. He and his sister had arrived at the Scotia Hotel about a month previously, and subsequently they were joined by the maid Campbell. Scotch people are far too reserved ever to speak of themselves or their affairs to strangers. Brother and sister spoke very little to anyone at the hotel. They had their meals in their sitting-room, waited on by the maid, who messed with the staff. But in face of the present terrible calamity, Miss Marvell's frigidity relaxed before the police inspector, to whom she gave what information she could about her brother. "He was like a son to me," she explained with scarcely restrained tears, "for we lost our parents early in life, and as we were left very, very badly off, our relations took but little notice of us. My brother was years younger than I am, and though he was a little wild and fond of pleasure, he was as good as gold to me, and has supported us both for years by journalistic work. We came to London from Glasgow about a month ago, because Leonard had got a very good appointment on the staff of the Daily Post." All of this, of course, was soon proved to be true, and although, on minute inquiries being instituted in Glasgow, but little seemed to be known about Mr. Leonard Marvell in that city, there seemed to be no doubt that he had done some reporting for the Courier, and that latterly, in response to an advertisement, he had applied for and obtained regular employment on the Daily Post. The latter enterprising halfpenny journal, with characteristic magnanimity, made an offer of £50 reward to any of its subscribers who gave information which would lead to the discovery of the whereabouts of Mr. Leonard Marvell. But time went by, and that £50 remained unclaimed. The Man in the Inverness Cape, Part II. Lady Molly had not seemed as interested as she usually was in cases of this sort. With strange flippancy, wholly unlike herself, she remarked that one Scotch journalist more or less in London did not vastly matter. I was much amused, therefore, one morning about 3 weeks after the mysterious disappearance of Mr. Leonard Marvell, when Jane, our little parlour-maid, brought in a card accompanied by a letter. The card bore the name Miss Olive Marvell. The letter was the usual formula from the chief, asking Lady Molly to have a talk with the lady in question, and to come and see him on the subject after the interview. With a smothered yawn, my dear lady told Jane to show in Miss Marvell. "There are 2 of them, my lady," said Jane as she prepared to obey. "2 what?" asked Lady Molly with a laugh. "2 ladies, I mean," explained Jane. "Well, show them both into the drawing-room," said Lady Molly impatiently. Then, as Jane went off on this errand, a very funny thing happened. Funny, because during the entire course of my intimate association with my dear lady, I had never known her to act with such marked indifference in the face of an obviously interesting case. She turned to me and said, "Mary, you had better see these 2 women, whoever they may be. I feel that they would bore me to distraction. Take note of what they say and let me know. Now, don't argue," she added with a laugh, which peremptorily put a stop to my rising protest, "but go and interview Miss Marvell and Company." Needless to say, I promptly did as I was told, and the next few seconds saw me installed in our little drawing-room, saying polite preliminaries to the 2 ladies who sat opposite to me. I had no need to ask which of them was Miss Marvell. Tall, ill-dressed in deep black, with a heavy crape veil over her face, and black cotton gloves, she looked the uncompromising Scotchwoman to the life. In strange contrast to her depressing appearance, there sat beside her an overdressed, much behatted, peroxided young woman, who bore the stamp of the profession all over her pretty painted face. Miss Marvell, I was glad to note, was not long in plunging into the subject which had brought her there. "I saw a gentleman at Scotland Yard," she explained after a short preamble, "because Miss–Lulu Fay came to me at the hotel this very morning with a story which, in my opinion, should have been told to the police directly my brother's disappearance became known, and not 3 weeks later." The emphasis which she laid on the last few words, and the stern look with which she regarded the golden-haired young woman beside her, showed the disapproval with which the rigid Scotchwoman viewed any connection which her brother might have had with the lady, whose very name seemed unpleasant to her lips. Miss–Lulu Fay blushed even through her rouge, and turned a pair of large liquid eyes imploringly upon me. I didn't know. I was frightened," she stammered.
"There's no occasion to be frightened now," retorted Miss Marvell, "and the sooner you try to be truthful about the whole matter, the better it will be for all of us." And the stern woman's lips closed with a snap as she deliberately turned her back on Miss Fay and began turning over the leaves of a magazine which happened to be on a table close to her hand. I muttered a few words of encouragement, for the little actress looked ready to cry. I spoke as kindly as I could, telling her that if indeed she could throw some light on Mr. Marvell's present whereabouts, it was her duty to be quite frank on the subject. She hemmed and hawed for a while, and her simpering ways were just beginning to tell on my nerves, when she suddenly started talking very fast. "I am principal boy at the Grand," she explained with great volubility, "and I know Mr. Leonard Marvell well. In fact, he paid me a good deal of attention, and—" "Yes, and?" I queried, for the girl was obviously nervous. There was a pause. Miss Fay began to cry. "And it seems that my brother took this young lady to supper on the night of February 3rd, after which no one has ever seen or heard of him again," here interposed Miss Marvell quietly. "Is that so?" I asked. Lulu Fay nodded, whilst heavy tears fell upon her clasped hands. "But why did you not tell this to the police 3 weeks ago?" I ejaculated, with all the sternness at my command. I was frightened," she stammered. "Frightened? Of what?" "I am engaged to Lord Montacute, and—" "And you did not wish him to know that you were accepting the attentions of Mr. Leonard Marvell? Was that it?" "Well," I added, with involuntary impatience, "what happened after you had supper with Mr. Marvell?" "Oh, I hope that nothing happened," she said through more tears. "We had supper at the Trocadero, and he saw me into my brougham. Suddenly, just as I was driving away, I saw Lord Montacute standing quite close to us in the crowd." "Did the two men know one another?" I asked. "No," replied Miss Fay. "At least, I don't think so. But when I looked back through the window of my carriage, I saw them standing on the curb, talking to each other for a moment, and then walk off together towards Piccadilly Circus. That is the last I have seen of either of them," continued the little actress with a fresh flood of tears. "Lord Montacute hasn't spoken to me since, and Mr. Marvell has disappeared with my money and my diamonds." "Your money and your diamonds?" I gasped in amazement. "Yes, he told me he was a jeweller, and that my diamonds wanted resetting. He took them with him that evening, for he said that London jewellers were clumsy thieves, and that he would love to do the work for me himself. I also gave him £200, which he said he would want for buying the gold and platinum required for the settings. And now he has disappeared, and my diamonds, and my money. Oh, I have been very, very foolish, and—" Her voice broke down completely. Of course, one often hears of the idiocy of girls giving money and jewels unquestioningly to clever adventurers who know how to trade upon their inordinate vanity. There was therefore nothing very out of the way in the story just told me by Lulu Fay, until the moment when Miss Marvell's quiet voice, with its marked Scotch burr, broke in upon the short silence which had followed the actress's narrative. "As I explained to the chief detective inspector at Scotland Yard," she said calmly, "the story which this young lady tells is only partly true. She may have had supper with Mr. Leonard Marvell on the night of February 3rd, and he may have paid her certain attentions, but he never deceived her by telling her he was a jeweller, nor did he obtain possession of her diamonds and her money through false statements. My brother was the soul of honour and loyalty. If for some reason, which Miss Lulu Fay chooses to keep secret, he had her jewels and money in his possession on the fete of February 3rd, then I think his disappearance is accounted for. He has been robbed and perhaps murdered." Like a true Scotchwoman, she did not give way to tears, but even her harsh voice trembled slightly when she thus bore witness to her brother's honesty and expressed the fears which assailed her as to his fate. Imagine my plight. I could ill forgive my dear lady for leaving me in this unpleasant position, a sort of peacemaker between two women who evidently hated one another, and each of whom was trying her best to give the other the lie direct. I ventured to ring for our faithful Jane, and to send her with an imploring message to Lady Molly, begging her to come and disentangle the threads of this muddled skein with her clever fingers, but Jane returned with a curt note from my dear lady
telling me not to worry about such a silly case, and to bow the two women out of the flat as soon as possible, and then come for a nice walk. I wore my official manner as well as I could, trying not to betray the 'prentice hand. Of course, the interview lasted a great deal longer, and there was considerably more talk than I can tell you of in a brief narrative. But the gist of it all was just as I have said. Miss Lulu Fay stuck to every point of the story which she had originally told Miss Marvell. It was the latter uncompromising lady who had immediately marched the younger woman off to Scotland Yard in order that she might repeat her tale to the police. I did not wonder that the chief promptly referred them both to Lady Molly. Anyway, I made excellent shorthand notes of the conflicting stories which I heard, and I finally saw, with real relief, the two women walk out of our little front door. The Man in the Inverness Cape, Part 3. Miss Lulu Fay, mind you, never contradicted in any one particular the original story which she had told me about going out to supper with Leonard Marvell, entrusting him with £200 and the diamonds, which he said he would have reset for her, and seeing him finally in close conversation with her recognized fiancé, Lord Mountnewte. Miss Marvell, on the other hand, very commendably refused to admit that her brother acted dishonestly towards the girl. If he had her jewels and money in his possession at the time of his disappearance, then he had undoubtedly been robbed, or perhaps murdered, on his way back to the hotel, and if Lord Mountnewte had been the last to speak to him on that fatal night, then Lord Mountnewte must be able to throw some light on the mysterious occurrence. Our fellows at the Yard were abnormally active. It seemed, on the face of it, impossible that a man, healthy, vigorous, and admittedly sober, should vanish in London between Piccadilly Circus and Cromwell Road, without leaving the slightest trace of himself or of the valuables said to have been in his possession. Of course, Lord Mountnewte was closely questioned. He was a young guardsman of the usual pattern, and after a great deal of vapid talk, which irritated Detective Inspector Saunders not a little, he made the following statement. "I certainly am acquainted with Miss Lulu Fay. On the night in question I was standing outside the truck, when I saw this young lady, at her own carriage window, talking to a tall man in an Inverness cape. She had, earlier in the day, refused my invitation to supper, saying that she was not feeling very well, and would go home directly after the theatre. Therefore I felt, naturally, a little vexed. I was just about to hail a taxi, meaning to go on to the club, when, to my intense astonishment, the man in the Inverness cape came up to me and asked if I could tell him the best way to get back to Cromwell Road." "And what did you do?" asked Saunders. "I walked a few steps with him and put him on his way," replied Lord Mountnewte blandly. In Saunders' own expressive words, he thought that story fishy. He could not imagine the arm of coincidence being quite so long as to cause these two men, who presumably were both in love with the same girl, and who had just met at a moment when one of them was obviously suffering pangs of jealousy, to hold merely a topographical conversation with one another. But it was equally difficult to suppose that the eldest son and heir of the Marquis of Loam should murder a successful rival and then rob him in the streets of London. Moreover, here came the eternal and unanswerable questions. If Lord Mountnewte had murdered Leonard Marvell, where and how had he done it, and what had he done with the body? I dare say you are wondering by this time why I have said nothing about the maid, Rosie Campbell. Well, plenty of very clever people, I mean those who write letters to the papers and give suggestions to every official department in the kingdom, thought that the police ought to keep a very strict eye upon that pretty Scotch lassie, for she was very pretty, and had quaint demure ways which rendered her singularly attractive, in spite of the fact that, for most masculine tastes, she would have been considered too tall. Of course, Saunders and Danvers kept an eye on her, you may be sure of that, and got a good deal of information about her from the people at the hotel. Most of it, unfortunately, was irrelevant to the case. She was maid attendant to Miss Marvell, who was feeble in health, and who went out but little. Rosie waited on her master and mistress upstairs, carrying their meals to their private room and doing their bedrooms. The rest of the day she was fairly free, and was quite sociable downstairs with the hotel staff. With regard to her movements and actions on that memorable 3rd of February, Saunders, though he worked very hard, could glean but little useful information. You see, In a hotel of that kind, with an average of 30 to 40 guests at one time, it is extremely difficult to state positively what any one person did or did not do on that particular day. Most people at the Scotia remembered that Miss Marvell dined in the table d'hôte room on that 3rd of February. This she did about once a fortnight, when her maid had an evening out. The hotel staff also recollected fairly distinctly that Miss Rosie Campbell was not in the steward's room at supper time that evening, but no one could remember definitely when she came in. One of the chambermaids who occupied the bedroom adjoining hers said she heard her moving about soon after midnight. The hall porter declared that he saw her come in just before 12:30, when he closed the doors for the night. But one of the ground-floor valets said that, on the morning of the 4th, he saw Miss Marvell's maid, in hat and coat, slip into the house and upstairs, very quickly and quietly, soon after the front doors were opened, namely, about 7 a.m. Here, of course, was a direct contradiction between the chambermaid and hall porter on the one side, and the valet on the other, whilst Miss Marvell said that Campbell came into her room and made her some tea long before 7 o'clock every morning, including that of the 4th. I assure you our fellows at the Yard were all ready to tear their hair out by the roots, from sheer aggravation at this maze of contradictions which met them at every turn. The whole thing seemed so simple. There was nothing to it, as it were, but very little real suggestion of foul play, and yet Mr. Leonard Marvell had disappeared, and no trace of him could be found. Everyone now talked freely of murder. London is a big town, and this would not have been the first instance of a stranger, for Mr. Leonard Marvell was practically a stranger in London, being enticed to a lonely part of the city on a foggy night, and there done away with and robbed, and the body hidden in an out-of-the-way cellar, where it might not be discovered for months to come. But the newspaper-reading public is notably fickle, and Mr. Leonard Marvell was soon forgotten by everyone, save the chief and the batch of our fellows who had charge of the case. Thus I heard through Danvers one day that Rosie Campbell had left Miss Marvell's employ, and was living in rooms in Findlater Terrace near Walham Green. I was alone in our Maida Vale flat at the time, my dear lady having gone to spend the week-end with the Dowager Lady Loam, who was an old friend of hers, nor, when she returned, did she seem any more interested in Rosie Campbell's movements than she had been hitherto. Yet another month went by, and I for one had absolutely ceased to think of the man in the Inverness cape, who had so mysteriously and so completely vanished in the very midst of busy London, when, one morning early in January, Lady Molly made her appearance in my room, looking more like the landlady of a disreputable gambling-house than anything else I could imagine. "What in the world—" I began. "Yes, I think I look the part," she replied, surveying with obvious complacency the extraordinary figure which confronted her in the glass. My dear lady had on a purple cloth coat and skirt of a peculiarly vivid hue, and of a singular cut, which made her matchless figure look like a sack of potatoes. Her soft brown hair was quite hidden beneath a transformation of that yellow-reddish tint only to be met with in very cheap dyes. As for her hat, I won't attempt to describe it. It towered above and around her face, which was plentifully covered with brick red, and with that kind of powder which causes the cheeks to look a deep mauve. My dear lady looked, indeed, a perfect picture of appalling vulgarity. "Where are you going in this elegant attire?" I asked in amazement. "I have taken rooms in Findlater Terrace," she replied lightly. "I feel that the air of Walham Green will do us both good. Our amiable, if somewhat slatternly landlady expects us in time for luncheon. You will have to keep rigidly in the background, Mary, all the while we are there. I said that I was bringing an invalid niece with me, and as a preliminary you may as well tie 2 or 3 thick veils over your face. I think I may safely promise that you won't be dull." And we certainly were not dull during our brief stay at 34 Findlater Terrace, Walham Green. Fully equipped and arrayed in our extraordinary garments, we duly arrived there in a rickety four-wheeler, on the top of which were perched 2 seedy-looking boxes. The landlady was a toothless old creature, who apparently thought washing a quite unnecessary proceeding. In this she was evidently at one with every one of her neighbours. Findlater Terrace looked unspeakably squalid. Groups of dirty children congregated in the gutters, and gave forth discordant shrieks as our cab drove up. Through my thick veils I thought that, some distance down the road, I spied a horsey-looking man in ill-fitting riding breeches and gaiters, who vaguely reminded me of Danvers. Within half an hour of our installation, and whilst we were eating a tough steak over a doubtful tablecloth, my dear lady told me that she had been waiting a full month until rooms in this particular house happened to be vacant. Fortunately, the population in Findlater Terrace is always a shifting one, and Lady Molly had kept a sharp eye on number 34, where, on the floor above, lived Miss Rosie Campbell. Directly the last set of lodgers walked out of the ground-floor rooms, we were ready to walk in. My dear lady's manners and customs, whilst living at the above aristocratic address, were fully in keeping with her appearance. The shrill, rasping voice which she assumed echoed from attic to cellar. One day I heard her giving vague hints to the landlady that her husband, Mr. Marcus Stein, had had a little trouble with the police about a small hotel which he had kept somewhere near Fitzroy Square, and where young gentlemen used to come and play cards of a night. The landlady was also made to understand that the worthy Mr. Stein was now living temporarily at His Majesty's expense, while Mrs. Stein had to live a somewhat secluded life, away from her fashionable friends. The misfortunes of the pseudo Mrs. Stein in no way marred the amiability of Mrs. Tredwen, our landlady. The inhabitants of Findlater Terrace care very little about the antecedents of their lodgers, so long as they pay their week's rent in advance, and settle their extras without much murmur. This Lady Molly did, with a generosity characteristic of an ex-lady of means. She never grumbled at the quantity of jam and marmalade which we were supposed to have consumed every week, and which anon reached titanic proportions. She tolerated Mrs. Tredwen's cat, tipped Ermyntrude, the tousled lodging-house slavey, lavishly, and lent the upstairs lodger her spirit lamp and curling tongs when Miss Rosie Campbell's got out of order. A certain degree of intimacy followed the loan of those curling tongs. Miss Campbell, reserved and demure, greatly sympathized with the lady, who was not on the best of terms with the police. I kept steadily in the background. The two ladies did not visit each other's rooms, but they held long and confidential conversations on the landings, and I gathered, presently, that the pseudo Mrs. Stein had succeeded in persuading Rosie Campbell that, if the police were watching number 34 Findlater Terrace at all, it was undoubtedly on account of the unfortunate Mr. Stein's faithful wife. I found it a little difficult to fathom Lady Molly's intentions. We had been in the house over 3 weeks, and nothing whatever had happened. Once I ventured on a discreet query as to whether we were to expect the sudden reappearance of Mr. Leonard Marvell. For if that's all about it, I argued, then surely the men from the yard could have kept the house in view without all this inconvenience and masquerading on our part. But to this tirade my dear lady vouchsafed no reply. She and her newly acquired friend were, about this time, deeply interested in the case known as the West End shop robberies, which no doubt you recollect, since they occurred such a very little while ago. Ladies who were shopping in the large drapers' emporiums during the crowded and busy sale time lost reticules, purses, and valuable parcels, without any trace of the clever thief being found. The drapers during sale time invariably employ detectives in plain clothes to look after their goods, but in this case it was the customers who were robbed, and the detectives, attentive to every attempt at shoplifting, had had no eyes for the more subtle thief. I had already noticed Miss Rosie Campbell's keen look of excitement whenever the pseudo Mrs. Stein discussed these cases with her. I was not a bit surprised, therefore, when one afternoon, at about tea-time, my dear lady came home from her habitual walk, and at the top of her shrill voice called out to me from the hall, "Mary, Mary, they've got the man of the shop robberies. He's given the silly police the slip this time, but they know who he is now, and I suppose they'll get him presently. 'Tisn't anybody I know," she added, with that harsh common laugh which she had adopted for her part. I came out of the room in response to her call, and was standing just outside our own sitting-room door. Mrs. Tredwen, too, bedraggled and unkempt as usual, had sneaked up the area steps, closely followed by Ermyntrude. But on the half-landing just above us, the trembling figure of Rosie Campbell, with scared white face and dilated eyes, looked on the verge of a sudden fall. Still talking shrilly and volubly, Lady Molly ran up to her, but Campbell met her halfway, and the pseudo Mrs. Stein, taking vigorous hold of her wrist, dragged her into our own sitting-room.
"Pull yourself together now," she said with rough kindness. "That owl Treadwin is listening, and you needn't let her know too much. Shut the door, Mary. Lord bless you, my dear, I've gone through worse scares than these. There, you just lie down on this sofa a bit. My niece will make you a nice cup of tea, and I'll go and get an evening paper and see what's going on. I suppose you're very interested in the shop robbery man, or you wouldn't have took on so."
Without waiting for Campbell's contradiction to this statement, Lady Molly flounced out of the house. Miss Campbell hardly spoke during the next 10 minutes that she and I were left alone together. She lay on the sofa with eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling, evidently still in a great state of fear. I had just got tea ready when Lady Molly came back. She had an evening paper in her hand, but threw this down on the table directly she came in.
"I could only get an early edition," she said breathlessly, "and the silly thing hasn't got anything in it about the matter."
She drew near the sofa, and subduing the shrillness of her voice, she whispered rapidly, bending down towards Campbell.
"There's a man hanging about at the corner down there. No, it's not the police," she added quickly, in response to the girl's sudden start of alarm. "Trust me, my dear, for knowing a tick when I see one. Why, I'd smell one half a mile off. No, my opinion is that it's your man, my dear, and that he's in a devil of a hole."
"Oh, he oughtn't to have come here," ejaculated Campbell in great alarm.
"He'll get me into trouble and do himself no good. He's been a fool," she added, with a fierceness wholly unlike her usual demure placidity. "Getting himself caught like that. Now I suppose we'll have to hook it, if there's time." "Can I do anything to help you?" asked the pseudo Mrs. Stein. "You know I've been through all this myself, when they was after Mr. Stein. Or perhaps Mary could do something."
"Well, yes," said the girl after a slight pause, during which she seemed to be gathering her wits together. "I'll write a note, and you shall take it, if you will, to a friend of mine, a lady who lives in the Cromwell Road. But if you still see a man lurking about the corner of the street, then, just as you pass him, say the word Campbell, and if he replies Rosie, then give him the note. Will you do that?" "Of course I will, my dear. Just you leave it all to me." And the pseudo Mrs. Stein brought ink and paper and placed them on the table. Rosie Campbell wrote a brief note, and then fastened it down with a bit of sealing wax before she handed it over to Lady Molly. The note was addressed to Miss Marvell, Scotia Hotel, Cromwell Road. "You understand," she said eagerly. "Don't give the note to the man unless he says Rosie in reply to the word Campbell." All right," said Lady Molly, slipping the note into her reticule. "And you go up to your room, Miss Campbell. It's no good giving that fool Treadwin too much to gossip about." Rosie Campbell went upstairs, and presently my dear lady and I were walking rapidly down the badly lighted street. "Where is the man?" I whispered eagerly, as soon as we were out of earshot of number 34. "There is no man," replied Lady Molly quickly. "But the West End shop thief?" I asked. "He hasn't been caught yet, and won't be either, for he is far too clever a scoundrel to fall into an ordinary trap." She did not give me time to ask further questions, for presently, when we had reached Reporton Square, my dear lady handed me the note written by Campbell, and said, "Go straight to the Scotia Hotel, and ask for Miss Marvell, and send up the note to her, but don't let her see you, as she knows you by sight. I must see the chief first, and will be with you as soon as possible. Having delivered the note, you must hang about outside as long as you can. Use your wits. She must not leave the hotel before I see her." There was no hansom to be got in this elegant quarter of town, so having parted from my dear lady, I made for the nearest underground station, and took a train for South Kensington. Thus it was nearly 7 o'clock before I reached the Scotia. In answer to my inquiries for Miss Marvell, I was told that she was ill in bed and could see no one. I replied that I had only brought a note for her, and would wait for a reply. Acting on my dear lady's instructions, I was as slow in my movements as ever I could be, and was some time in finding the note and handing it to a waiter, who then took it upstairs. Presently he returned with the message, "Miss Marvell says there is no answer," whereupon I asked for pen and paper at the office, and wrote the following brief note on my own responsibility, using my wits as my dear lady had bidden me to do. "Please, madam," I wrote, Will you send just a line to Miss Rosie Campbell? She seems very upset and frightened at some news she has had." Once more the waiter ran upstairs, and returned with a sealed envelope, which I slipped into my reticule. Time was slipping by very slowly. I did not know how long I should have to wait outside in the cold, when, to my horror, I heard a hard voice with a marked Scotch accent saying, "I am going out, waiter, and shan't be back to dinner. Tell them to lay a little cold supper upstairs in my room." The next moment Miss Marvell, with coat, hat, and veil, was descending the stairs. My plight was awkward. I certainly did not think it safe to present myself before the lady. She would undoubtedly recollect my face. Yet I had orders to detain her until the appearance of Lady Molly. Miss Marvell seemed in no hurry. She was putting on her gloves as she came downstairs. In the hall she gave a few more instructions to the porter, whilst I, in a dark corner in the background, was vaguely planning an assault or an alarm of fire. Suddenly, at the hotel entrance, where the porter was obsequiously holding open the door for Miss Marvell to pass through, I saw the latter's figure stiffen. She took one step back, as if involuntarily, then equally quickly attempted to dart across the threshold, on which a group, composed of my dear lady, of Saunders, and of 2 or 3 people scarcely distinguishable in the gloom beyond, had suddenly made its appearance. Miss Marvell was forced to retreat into the hall. Already I had heard Saunders' hurriedly whispered words, "Try not to make a fuss in this place now. Everything can go off quietly, you know." Danvers and Cotton, whom I knew well, were already standing one each side of Miss Marvell, while suddenly amongst this group I recognised Fanny, the wife of Danvers, who is one of our female searchers at the Yard. "Shall we go up to your own room?" suggested Saunders. "I think that is quite unnecessary," interposed Lady Molly. "I feel convinced that Mr. Leonard Marvell will yield to the inevitable quietly, and follow you without giving any trouble." Marvell, however, did make a bold dash for liberty. As Lady Molly had said previously, he was far too clever to allow himself to be captured easily. But my dear lady had been cleverer. As she told me subsequently, she had from the first suspected that the trio who lodged at the Scotia Hotel were really only a duo, namely, Leonard Marvell and his wife. The latter impersonated a maid most of the time, but among these 2 clever people the 3 characters were interchangeable. Of course, there was no Miss Marvell at all. Leonard was alternately dressed up as man or woman, according to the requirements of his villainies. "As soon as I heard that Miss Marvell was very tall and bony," said Lady Molly, "I thought that there might be a possibility of her being merely a man in disguise. Then there was the fact, but little dwelt on by either the police or the public, that no one seems ever to have seen brother and sister together. Nor was the entire trio ever seen at one and the same time. On that 3rd of February, Leonard Marvell went out. No doubt he changed his attire in a ladies' waiting-room at one of the railway stations. Subsequently he came home, now dressed as Miss Marvell, and had dinner in the table d'hôte room so as to set up a fairly plausible alibi. But ultimately it was his wife, the pseudo Rosie Campbell, who stayed indoors that night, whilst he, Leonard Marvell, when going out after dinner, impersonated the maid until he was clear of the hotel. Then he resumed his male clothes once more, no doubt in the deserted waiting-room of some railway station, and met Miss Lulu Fay at supper, subsequently returning to the hotel in the guise of the maid. You see the game of criss-cross, don't you? This interchanging of characters was bound to baffle everyone. Many clever scoundrels have assumed disguises, sometimes impersonating members of the opposite sex to their own, but never before have I known 2 people play the part of 3. Thus endless contradictions followed as to the hour when Campbell the maid went out and when she came in, for at one time it was she herself who was seen by the valet, and at another it was Leonard Marvell dressed in her clothes. He was also clever enough to accost Lord Montnewt in the open street, thus bringing further complications into this strange case. After the successful robbery of Miss Fay's diamonds, Leonard Marvell and his wife parted for a while. They were waiting for an opportunity to get across the Channel, and there turn their booty into solid cash, whilst Mrs. Marvell, alias Rosie Campbell, led a retired life in Findlater Terrace. Leonard kept his hand in with West End shop robberies. Then Lady Molly entered the lists. As usual, her scheme was bold and daring. She trusted her own intuition and acted accordingly. When she brought home the false news that the author of the shop robberies had been spotted by the police, Rosie Campbell's obvious terror confirmed her suspicions. The note written by the latter to the so-called Miss Marvell, though it contained nothing in any way incriminating, was the crowning certitude that my dear lady was right, as usual, in all her surmises. And now Mr. Leonard Marvell will be living for a couple of years at the taxpayer's expense. He has disappeared temporarily from the public eye. Rosie Campbell, that is Mrs. Marvell, has gone to Glasgow. I feel convinced that 2 years hence we shall hear of the worthy couple again. End of The Man in the Inverness Cape. Chapter 10, Part 1 of Lady Molly of Scotland Yard, by Baroness Orczy. The Woman in the Big Hat, Part 1. Lady Molly always had the idea that if the finger of fate had pointed to Mathes's in Regent Street rather than to Lyons's as the most advisable place for us to have a cup of tea that afternoon, Mr. Culledon would be alive at the present moment. My dear lady is quite sure, and needless to say that I share her belief in herself, that she would have anticipated the murderer's intentions, and thus prevented one of the most cruel and callous of crimes which ever were perpetrated in the heart of London. She and I had been to a matinee of Trilby, and were having tea at Lyons's, which is exactly opposite Mathes's Vienna Café in Regent Street. From where we sat we commanded a view of the street and of the café, which had been very crowded during the last hour. We had lingered over our toasted muffin until past 6, when our attention was drawn to the unusual commotion which had arisen both outside and in the brilliantly lighted place over the road. We saw 2 men run out of the doorway, and return a minute or 2 later in company with a policeman. You know what is the inevitable result of such a proceeding in London. Within 3 minutes a crowd had collected outside Mathes's. 2 or 3 more constables had already assembled, and had some difficulty in keeping the entrance clear of intruders. But already my dear lady, keen as a pointer on the scent, had hastily paid her bill, and without waiting to see if I followed her or not, had quickly crossed the road, and the next moment her graceful form was lost in the crowd. I went after her, impelled by curiosity, and presently caught sight of her in close conversation with one of our own men. I have always thought that Lady Molly must have eyes at the back of her head. Otherwise, how could she have known that I stood behind her now? Anyway, she beckoned to me, and together we entered Mathes's, much to the astonishment and anger of the less fortunate crowd. The usually gay little place was indeed sadly transformed. In one corner the waitresses, in dainty caps and aprons, had put their heads together, and were eagerly whispering to one another, whilst casting furtive looks at the small group assembled in front of one of those pretty alcoves, which, as you know, line the walls all round the big tea-room at Mathes's. Here 2 of our men were busy with pencil and notebook, whilst one fair-haired waitress, dissolved in tears, was apparently giving them a great deal of irrelevant and confused information. Chief Inspector Saunders had, I understood, been already sent for. The constables, confronted with this extraordinary tragedy, were casting anxious glances towards the main entrance, whilst putting the conventional questions to the young waitress. And in the alcove itself, raised from the floor of the room by a couple of carpeted steps, the cause of all this commotion, all this anxiety, and all these tears, sat huddled up on a chair, with arms lying straight across the marble-topped table, on which the usual paraphernalia of afternoon tea still lay scattered about. The upper part of the body, limp, backboneless, and awry, half propped up against the wall, half falling back upon the outstretched arms, told quite plainly its weird tale of death. Before my dear lady and I had time to ask any questions, Saunders arrived in a taxicab. He was accompanied by the medical officer, Dr. Townson, who at once busied himself with the dead man, while Saunders went up quickly to Lady Molly. "The Chief suggested sending for you," he said quickly. "He was phoning you when I left. There's a woman in this case, and we shall rely on you a good deal." "What has happened?" asked my dear lady, whose fine eyes were glowing with excitement at the mere suggestion of work. "I have only a few stray particulars," replied Saunders, "but the chief witness is that yellow-haired girl over there. We'll find out what we can from her directly Dr. Townson has given us his opinion." The medical officer, who had been kneeling beside the dead man, now rose and turned to Saunders. His face was very grave. "The whole matter is simple enough as far as I am concerned," he said. "The man has been killed by a terrific dose of morphia, administered no doubt in this cup of chocolate. he added, pointing to a cup in which there still lingered the cold dregs of the thick beverage.
"But when did this occur?"
asked Saunders, turning to the waitress.
"I can't say," she replied, speaking with obvious nervousness. The gentleman came in very early with a lady, somewhere about 4. They made straight for this alcove. The place was just beginning to fill, and the music had begun." "And where is the lady now?"
"She went off almost directly. She had ordered tea for herself and a cup of chocolate for the gentleman. Also muffins and cakes. About 5 minutes afterwards, as I went past their table, I heard her say to him, 'I am afraid I must go now, or Jay's will be closed, but I'll be back in less than half an hour. You'll wait for me, won't you?'
"Did the gentleman seem all right then?"
"Oh, yes," said the waitress. "He had just begun to sip his chocolate, and merely said, 'S'long,' as she gathered up her gloves and muff and went out of the shop."
"And she has not returned since?"
"No." "When did you first notice that there was anything wrong with this gentleman?" asked Lady Molly. "Well," said the girl with some hesitation, "I looked at him once or twice as I went up and down, for he certainly seemed to have fallen all of a heap. Of course, I thought that he had gone to sleep, and I spoke to the manageress about him, but she thought that I ought to leave him alone for a bit. Then we got very busy, and I paid no more attention to him until about 6 o'clock, when most afternoon tea customers had gone, and we were beginning to get the tables ready for dinners. Then I certainly did think there was something wrong with the man. I called to the manageress, and we sent for the police."
"And the lady who was with him at first? What was she like? Would you know her again?"
queried Saunders. "I don't know," replied the girl. "You see, I have to attend to such crowds of people of an afternoon. I can't notice each one. And she had on one of those enormous mushroom hats. No one could have seen her face, not more than her chin, unless they looked right up under the hat." "Would you know the hat again?" asked Lady Molly. "Yes, I think I should," said the waitress. "It was black velvet and had a lot of plumes. It was enormous," she added, with a sigh of admiration and of longing for the monumental headgear. During the girl's narrative, one of the constables had searched the dead man's pockets. Among other items, he had found several letters addressed to Mark Culledon, Esquire, some with an address in Lombard Street, others with one in Fitzjohn's Avenue, Hampstead. The initials M.C., which appeared both in the hat and on the silver mount of a letter case belonging to the unfortunate gentleman, proved his identity beyond a doubt. A house in Fitzjohn's Avenue does not, somehow, suggest a bachelor establishment. Even whilst Saunders and the other men were looking through the belongings of the deceased, Lady Molly had already thought of his family. Children, perhaps a wife, a mother, who could tell? What awful news to bring to an unsuspecting, happy family, who might even now be expecting the return of father, husband, or son, at the very moment when he lay murdered in a public place, the victim of some hideous plot or feminine revenge. As our amiable friends in Paris would say, it jumped to the eyes that there was a woman in the case, a woman who had worn a gargantuan hat for the obvious purpose of remaining unidentifiable when the question of the unfortunate victim's companion that afternoon came up for solution. And all these facts to put before an expectant wife or an anxious mother. As no doubt you have already foreseen, Lady Molly took the difficult task on her own kind shoulders. She and I drove together to Lorbury House, Fitzjohn's Avenue, and on asking of the manservant who opened the door if his mistress were at home, we were told that Lady Irene Culledon was in the drawing-room. Mine is not a story of sentiment, so I am not going to dwell on that interview, which was one of the most painful moments I recollect having lived through. Lady Irene was young, not 25, I should say, petite and frail-looking, but with a quiet dignity of manner which was most impressive. She was Irish, as you know, the daughter of the Earl of Athyville, and it seems had married Mr. Mark Culledon in the teeth of strenuous opposition on the part of her family, which was as penniless as it was aristocratic, whilst Mr. Culledon had great prospects and a splendid business, but possessed neither ancestors nor high connections. She had only been married 6 months, poor little soul, and from all accounts must have idolized her husband. Lady Molly broke the news to her with infinite tact. But there it was. It was a terrific blow, wasn't it? To deal to a young wife, now a widow, and there was so little that a stranger could say in these circumstances. Even my dear lady's gentle voice, her persuasive eloquence, her kindly words, seemed empty and conventional in the face of such appalling grief. The Woman in the Big Hat, Part 2. Of course, everyone expected that the inquest would reveal something of the murdered man's inner life, would, in fact, allow the over-eager public to get a peep into Mr. Mark Culledon's secret orchard, wherein walked a lady who wore abnormally large velvet hats, and who nourished in her heart one of those terrible grudges against a man which can only find satisfaction in crime. Equally, of course, the inquest revealed nothing that the public did not already know. The young widow was extremely reticent on the subject of her late husband's life, and the servants had all been fresh arrivals when the young couple, just home from their honeymoon, organized their new household at Lorbury House. There was an old aunt of the deceased, a Mrs. Steinberg, who lived with the Culledons, but who at the present moment was very ill. Someone in the house, one of the younger servants probably, very foolishly had told her every detail of the awful tragedy. With positively amazing strength, the invalid thereupon insisted on making a sworn statement, which she desired should be placed before the coroner's jury. She wished to bear solemn testimony to the integrity of her late nephew, Mark Culledon, in case the personality of the mysterious woman in the big hat suggested to evilly disposed minds any thought of scandal. "Mark Culledon was the one nephew whom I loved," she stated with solemn emphasis. "I have shown my love for him by bequeathing to him the large fortune which I inherited from the late Mr. Steinberg. Mark was the soul of honour, or I should have cut him out of my will, as I did my other nephews and nieces. I was brought up in a Scotch home, and I hate all this modern fastness and smartness, which are only other words for what I call profligacy." Needless to say, the old lady's statement, solemn though it was of no use whatever for the elucidation of the mystery which surrounded the death of Mr. Mark Culledon. But as Mrs. Steinberg had talked of other nephews, whom she had cut out of her will in favour of the murdered man, the police directed inquiries in those various quarters. Mr. Mark Culledon certainly had several brothers and sisters, also cousins, who at different times, usually for some peccadillo or other, seemed to have incurred the wrath of the straight-laced old lady. But there did not appear to have been any ill feeling in the family owing to this. Mrs. Steinberg was sole mistress of her fortune. She might just as well have bequeathed it in toto to some hospital as to one particular nephew whom she favoured, and the various relations were glad, on the whole, that the money was going to remain in the family rather than be cast abroad. The mystery surrounding the woman in the big hat deepened as the days went by. As you know, the longer the period of time which elapses between a crime and the identification of the criminal, the greater chance the latter has of remaining at large. In spite of strenuous efforts and close questionings of every one of the employees at Mathes's, no one could give a very accurate description of the lady who had tea with the deceased on that fateful afternoon. The first glimmer of light on the mysterious occurrence was thrown, about 3 weeks later, by a young woman named Catherine Harris, who had been parlour-maid at Lorbury House when first Mr. and Lady Irene Culledon returned from their honeymoon. I must tell you that Mrs. Steinberg had died a few days after the inquest. The excitement had been too much for her enfeebled heart. Just before her death she had deposited £250 with her banker, which sum was to be paid over to any person giving information which would lead to the apprehension and conviction of the murderer of Mr. Mark Culledon. This offer had stimulated everyone's zeal, and, I presume, had aroused Catherine Harris to a realization of what had all the while been her obvious duty. Lady Molly saw her in the chief's private office, and had much ado to disentangle the threads of the girl's confused narrative. But the main point of Harris's story was that a foreign lady had once called at Lorbury House, about a week after the master and mistress had returned from their honeymoon. Lady Irene was out at the time, and Mr. Culledon saw the lady in his smoking-room. "She was a very handsome lady," explained Harris, "and was beautifully dressed." "Did she wear a large hat?" asked the chief. "I don't remember if it was particularly large," replied the girl. "But you remember what the lady was like?" suggested Lady Molly. "Yes, pretty well. She was very, very tall, and very good-looking." "Would you know her again if you saw her?" rejoined my lady. "Oh, yes, I think so," was Katherine Harris's reply. Unfortunately, beyond this assurance, the girl could say nothing very definite. The foreign lady seems to have been closeted with Mr. Culledon for about an hour, at the end of which time Lady Irene came home. The butler being out that afternoon, it was Harris who let her mistress in, and as the latter asked no questions, the girl did not volunteer the information that her master had a visitor. She went back to the servants' hall, but 5 minutes later the smoking-room bell rang, and she had to run up again. The foreign lady was then in the hall alone, and obviously wanting to be shown out. This Harris did, after which Mr. Culledon came out of his room, and in the girl's own graphic words, "He went on dreadful. I didn't know I had done anything so very wrong," she explained, "but the master seemed quite furious, and said I wasn't a proper parlour maid, or I'd have known that visitors must not be shown in straight away like that. I ought to have said that I didn't know if Mr. Culledon was in, and that I would go and see. Oh, he did go on at me," continued Katherine Harris volubly, "and I suppose he complained to the mistress, for she gave me notice the next day." "And you have never seen the foreign lady since?" concluded Lady Molly. "No, she never come while I was there." "By the way, how did you know she was foreign? Did she speak like a foreigner?" "Oh, no," replied the girl. "She did not say much, only asked for Mr. Culledon, but she looked French-like." This unanswerable bit of logic concluded Katherine's statement. She was very anxious to know whether, if the foreign lady was hanged for murder, she herself would get the £250. On Lady Molly's assurance that she certainly would, she departed in apparent content. The Woman in the Big Hat, Part 3. "Well, we are no nearer than we were before," said the chief, with an impatient sigh, when the door had closed behind Katherine Harris. "Don't you think so?" rejoined Lady Molly blandly. "Do you consider that what we heard just now has helped us to discover who was the woman in the big hat?" retorted the chief, somewhat testily. "Perhaps not," replied my dear lady with her sweet smile, "but it may help us to discover who murdered Mr. Culledon." With which enigmatic statement she effectually silenced the chief, and finally walked out of his office, followed by her faithful Mary. Following Katherine Harris's indications, a description of the lady who was wanted in connection with the murder of Mr. Culledon was very widely circulated, and within 2 days of the interview with the ex-parlour-maid, another very momentous one took place in the same office. Lady Molly was at work with the chief over some reports, whilst I was taking shorthand notes at a side desk, when a card was brought in by one of the men, and the next moment, without waiting either for permission to enter or to be more formally announced, a magnificent apparition literally sailed into the dust-covered little back office, filling it with an atmosphere of Parma violets and Russia leather. I don't think that I had ever seen a more beautiful woman in my life. Tall, with a splendid figure and perfect carriage, she vaguely reminded me of the portraits one sees of the late Empress of Austria. This lady was, moreover, dressed to perfection, and wore a large hat adorned with a quantity of plumes. The chief had instinctively risen to greet her, whilst Lady Molly, still and placid, was eyeing her with a quizzical smile. "You know who I am, sir," began the visitor, as soon as she had sunk gracefully into a chair. "My name is on that card. My appearance, I understand, tallies exactly with that of a woman who is supposed to have murdered Mark Culledon." She said this so calmly, with such perfect self-possession, that I literally gasped. The chief, too, seemed to have been metaphorically lifted off his feet. He tried to mutter a reply. "Oh, don't trouble yourself, sir," she interrupted him with a smile. "My landlady, my servant, my friends have all read the description of the woman who murdered Mr. Culledon. For the past 24 hours I have been watched by your police. Therefore I have come to you of my own accord, before they came to arrest me in my flat. I am not too soon, am I?" she asked, with the same cool indifference which was so startling, considering the subject of her conversation. She spoke English with a scarcely perceptible foreign accent, but I quite understood what Katherine Harris had meant when she said that the lady looked French-like. She certainly did not look English, and when I caught sight of her name on the card which the chief had handed to Lady Molly, I put her down at once as Viennese. Miss Elizabeth Löwenthal had all the charm, the grace, the elegance, which one associates with Austrian women more than with those of any other nation. No wonder the chief found it difficult to tell her that, as a matter of fact, the police were about to apply for a warrant that very morning for her arrest, on the charge of wilful murder. I know, she said, seeming to divine his thoughts. But let me tell you at once, sir, that I did not murder Mark Culledon. He treated me shamefully, and I would willingly have made a scandal just to spite him. He had become so respectable and straight-laced. But between scandal and murder there is a wide gulf. Don't you think so, madam? She added, turning for the first time towards Lady Molly. Undoubtedly, replied my dear lady, with the same quizzical smile. A wide gulf which, no doubt, Miss Elizabeth Löwenthal will best be able to demonstrate to the magistrate to-morrow, rejoined the chief, with official sternness of manner. I thought that, for the space of a few seconds, the lady lost her self-assurance at this obvious suggestion. The bloom on her cheeks seemed to vanish, and two hard lines appeared between her fine eyes. But, frightened or not, she quickly recovered herself and said quietly, Now, my dear sir, let us understand one another. I came here for that express purpose. I take it that you don't want your police to look ridiculous any more than I want a scandal. I don't want detectives to hang about round my flat, questioning my neighbours and my servants. They would soon find out that I did not murder Mark Culledon, of course. But the atmosphere of the police would hang round me, and I prefer Parma violets, she added, raising a daintily perfumed handkerchief to her nose. Then you have come to make a statement? Asked the chief. Yes, she replied. I'll tell you all I know. Mr. Culledon was engaged to marry me. Then he met the daughter of an earl, and thought he would like her better as a wife than a simple Miss Löwenthal. I suppose I should be considered an undesirable match for a young man who has a highly respectable and snobbish aunt, who would leave him all her money only on the condition that he made a suitable marriage. I have a voice, and I came over to England 2 years ago to study English, so that I might sing an oratorio at the Albert Hall. I met Mark on the Calais Dover boat, when he was returning from a holiday abroad. He fell in love with me, and presently he asked me to be his wife. After some demur, I accepted him. We became engaged, but he told me that our engagement must remain a secret, for he had an old aunt from whom he had great expectations, and who might not approve of his marrying a foreign girl, who was without connections and a professional singer. From that moment I mistrusted him, nor was I very astonished when gradually his affection for me seemed to cool. Soon after he informed me quite callously that he had changed his mind and was going to marry some swell English lady. I didn't care much, but I wanted to punish him by making a scandal, you understand. I went to his house just to worry him, and finally I decided to bring an action for breach of promise against him. It would have upset him, I know. No doubt his aunt would have cut him out of her will. That is all I wanted, but I did not care enough about him to murder him. Somehow her tale carried conviction. We were all of us obviously impressed. The chief alone looked visibly disturbed, and I could read what was going on in his mind. As you say, Miss Löwenthal, he rejoined, the police would have found all this out within the next few hours. Once your connection with the murdered man was known to us, the record of your past and his becomes an easy one to peruse. No doubt, too, he added insinuatingly, our men would soon have been placed in possession of the one undisputable proof of your complete innocence with regard to that fateful afternoon spent at Mathis's café. What is that? She queried blandly. An alibi. You mean where I was during the time that Mark was being murdered in a tea shop? Yes, said the chief. I was out for a walk, she replied quietly. Shopping, perhaps? No. You met someone who would remember the circumstance, or your servants could say at what time you came in? No, she replied dryly. I met no one, for I took a brisk walk on Primrose Hill. My 2 servants could only say that I went out at 3 o'clock that afternoon and returned after 5. There was silence in the little office for a moment or two. I could hear the scraping of the pen with which the chief was idly scribbling geometrical figures on his blotting pad. Lady Molly was quite still. Her large, luminous eyes were fixed on the beautiful woman who had just told us her strange story, with its unaccountable sequel, its mystery which had deepened with the last phrase which she had uttered. Miss Löwenthal, I felt sure, was conscious of her peril. I am not sufficiently a psychologist to know whether it was guilt or merely fear which was distorting the handsome features now, hardening the face and causing the lips to tremble. Lady Molly scribbled a few words on a scrap of paper, which she then passed over to the chief. Miss Löwenthal was making visible efforts to steady her nerves. "That is all I have to tell you," she said, in a voice which sounded dry and harsh. "I think I will go home now." But she did not rise from her chair, and seemed to hesitate, as if fearful lest permission to go were not granted her. To her obvious astonishment, and I must add to my own, the chief immediately rose and said quite urbanely, "I thank you very much for the helpful information which you have given me. Of course, we may rely on your presence in town for the next few days, may we not?" She seemed greatly relieved, and all at once resumed her former charm of manner and elegance of attitude. The beautiful face was lit up by a smile. The chief was bowing to her in quite a foreign fashion, and in spite of her visible reassurance she eyed him very intently. Then she went up to Lady Molly and held out her hand. My dear lady took it without an instant's hesitation. I, who knew that it was the few words hastily scribbled by Lady Molly which had dictated the chief's conduct with regard to Miss Löwenthal, was left wondering whether the woman I loved best in all the world had been shaking hands with a murderess. The Woman in the Big Hat, Part 4. No doubt you will remember the sensation which was caused by the arrest of Miss Löwenthal on a charge of having murdered Mr. Mark Culledon by administering morphia to him in a cup of chocolate at Mathis' Café in Regent Street. The beauty of the accused, her undeniable charm of manner, the hitherto blameless character of her life, all tended to make the public take violent sides either for or against her, and the usual budget of amateur correspondence, suggestions, recriminations, and advice poured into the chief's office in titanic proportions. I must say that, personally, all my sympathies went out to Miss Löwenthal. As I have said before, I am no psychologist, but I had seen her in the original interview at the office, and I could not get rid of an absolutely unreasoning certitude that the beautiful Viennese singer was innocent. The magistrate's court was packed, as you may well imagine, on that first day of the inquiry, and, of course, sympathy with the accused went up to fever pitch when she staggered into the dock, beautiful still, despite the ravages caused by horror, anxiety, fear, in the face of the deadly peril in which she stood. The magistrate was most kind to her, her solicitor was unimpeachably assiduous, even our fellows, who had to give evidence against her, did no more than their duty, and were as lenient in their statements as possible. Miss Löwenthal had been arrested in her flat by Danvers, accompanied by 2 constables. She had loudly protested her innocence all along, and did so still, pleading, "Not guilty," in a firm voice. The great points in favour of the arrest were, firstly, the undoubted motive of disappointment and revenge against a faithless sweetheart, then the total inability to prove any kind of alibi, which, under the circumstances, certainly added to the appearance of guilt. The question of where the fatal drug was obtained was more difficult to prove. It was stated that Mr. Mark Culledon was director of several important companies, one of which carried on business as wholesale druggists. Therefore it was argued that the accused, at different times and under some pretext or other, had obtained drugs from Mr. Culledon himself. She had admitted to having visited the deceased at his office in the city, both before and after his marriage. Miss Löwenthal listened to all this evidence against her with a hard, set face, as she did also to Catherine Harris's statement about her calling on Mr. Culledon at Lorbury House. But she brightened up visibly when the various attendants at Mathis' Café were placed in the box. A very large hat belonging to the accused was shown to the witnesses, but though the police upheld the theory that that was the headgear worn by the mysterious lady at the café on that fateful afternoon, the waitresses made distinctly contradictory statements with regard to it. Whilst one girl swore that she recognized the very hat, another was equally positive that it was distinctly smaller than the one she recollected, and when the hat was placed on the head of Miss Löwenthal, 3 out of the 4 witnesses positively refused to identify her. Most of these young women declared that though the accused, when wearing the big hat, looked as if she might have been the lady in question, yet there was a certain something about her which was different. With that vagueness which is a usual and highly irritating characteristic of their class, the girls finally parried every question by refusing to swear positively either for or against the identity of Miss Löwenthal. "There's something that's different about her somehow," one of the waitresses asserted positively. "What is it that's different?" asked the solicitor for the accused, pressing his point. "I can't say," was the perpetual, maddening reply. Of course, the poor young widow had to be dragged into the case, and here, I think, opinions and even expressions of sympathy were quite unanimous. The whole tragedy had been inexpressibly painful to her, of course, and now it must have seemed doubly so. The scandal which had accumulated round her late husband's name must have added the poignancy of shame to that of grief. Mark Culledon had behaved as callously to the girl whom clearly he had married from interested family motives as he had to the one whom he had heartlessly cast aside. Lady Irene, however, was most moderate in her statements. There was no doubt that she had known of her husband's previous entanglement with Miss Löwenthal, but apparently had not thought fit to make him accountable for the past. She did not know that Miss Löwenthal had threatened a breach of promise action against her husband. Throughout her evidence she spoke with absolute calm and dignity, and looked indeed a strange contrast in her closely fitting tailor-made costume of black serge and tiny black toque to the more brilliant woman who stood in the dock. The two great points in favour of the accused were, firstly, the vagueness of the witnesses who were called to identify her, and secondly, the fact that she had undoubtedly begun proceedings for breach of promise against the deceased. Judging by the latter's letters to her, she would have had a splendid case against him, which fact naturally dealt a severe blow to the theory as to motive for the murder. On the whole, the magistrate felt that there was not a sufficiency of evidence against the accused to warrant his committing her for trial. He therefore discharged her, and amid loud applause from the public, Miss Löwenthal left the court a free woman. Now I know that the public did loudly, and to my mind very justly, blame the police for that arrest, which was denounced as being as cruel as it was unjustifiable. I felt as strongly as anybody on the subject, for I knew that the prosecution had been instituted in defiance of Lady Molly's express advice, and in distinct contradiction to the evidence which she had collected. When, therefore, the chief asked my dear lady to renew her efforts in that mysterious case, it was small wonder that her enthusiasm did not respond to his anxiety. That she would do her duty was beyond a doubt, but she had very naturally lost her more fervent interest in the case. The mysterious woman in the big hat was still the chief subject of leading articles in the papers, coupled with that of the ineptitude of the police who could not discover her. There were caricatures and picture postcards in all the shop windows of a gigantic hat covering the whole figure of its wearer, only the feet, and a very long and pointed chin protruding from beneath the enormous brim. Below was the device, "Who is she? Ask the police?" One day, it was the second since the discharge of Miss Löwenthal, my dear lady came into my room beaming. It was the first time I had seen her smile for more than a week, and already I had guessed what it was that had cheered her. "Good news, Mary," she said gaily. "At last I've got the chief to let me have a free hand. Oh dear, what a lot of argument it takes to extricate that man from the tangled meshes of red tape." "What are you going to do?" I asked. "Prove that my theory is right as to who murdered Mark Culledon," she replied seriously, "and as a preliminary, we'll go and ask his servants at Lorbury House a few questions." It was then 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At Lady Molly's bidding I dressed somewhat smartly, and together we went off in a taxi to Fitzjohn's Avenue. Lady Molly had written a few words on one of her cards, urgently requesting an interview with Lady Irene Culledon. This she handed over to the manservant who opened the door at Lorbury House. A few moments later we were sitting in the cosy boudoir. The young widow, high-bred and dignified in her tight-fitting black gown, sat opposite to us, her white hands folded demurely before her, her small head, with its very close coiffure, bent in closest attention towards Lady Molly. "I most sincerely hope, Lady Irene," began my dear lady in her most gentle and persuasive voice, "that you'll look with all possible indulgence on my growing desire, shared, I may say, by all of my superiors at Scotland Yard, to elucidate the mystery which still surrounds your late husband's death." Lady Molly paused, as if waiting for encouragement to proceed. The subject must have been extremely painful to the young widow. Nevertheless, she responded quite gently. "I can understand that the police wish to do their duty in the matter. As for me, I have done all, I think, that could be expected of me. I am not made of iron, and after that day in the police court—" She checked herself, as if afraid of having betrayed more emotion than was consistent with good breeding, and concluded more calmly, "I cannot do any more." I fully appreciate your feelings in the matter," said Lady Molly, "but you would not mind helping us, would you? In a passive way, if you could, by some simple means, further the cause of justice?" "What is it you want me to do?" asked Lady Irene. "Only to allow me to ring for two of your maids and ask them a few questions. I promise you that they shall not be of such a nature as to cause you the slightest pain." For a moment I thought that the young widow hesitated. Then, without a word, she rose and rang the bell. "Which of my servants did you wish to see?" she asked, turning to my dear lady as soon as the butler entered in answer to the bell. "Your own maid and parlour maid, if I may," replied Lady Molly. Lady Irene gave the necessary orders, and we all sat expectant and silent until, a minute or two later, two girls entered the room. One wore a cap and apron, the other, in neat black dress and a dainty lace collar, was obviously the lady's maid. "This lady," said their mistress, addressing the two girls, "wishes to ask you a few questions. She is a representative of the police, so you had better do your best to satisfy her with your answers." "Oh," rejoined Lady Molly pleasantly, choosing not to notice the tone of acerbity with which the young widow had spoken, nor the unmistakable barrier of hostility and reserve which her words had immediately raised between the young servants and the representative of the police. "What I am going to ask these two young ladies is neither very difficult nor very unpleasant. I merely want their kind help in a little comedy which will have to be played this evening, in order to test the accuracy of certain statements made by one of the waitresses at Mathis' tea shop with regard to the terrible tragedy which has darkened this house. You will do that much, will you not?" she added, speaking directly to the maids. No one can be so winning or so persuasive as my dear lady. In a moment I saw the girl's hostility melting before the sunshine of Lady Molly's smile. "We'll do what we can, ma'am," said the maid. "There's a brave good girl," replied my lady. "You must know that the chief waitress at Mathis' has this very morning identified the woman in the big hat who, we all believe, murdered your late master. Yes," she continued, in response to a gasp of astonishment which seemed to go round the room like a wave. "The girl seems quite positive, both as regards the hat and the woman who wore it. But, of course, one cannot allow a human life to be sworn away without bringing every possible proof to bear on such a statement. And I am sure that everyone in this house will understand that we don't want to introduce strangers more than we can help into this sad affair, which already has been bruited abroad too much." She paused a moment. Then, as neither Lady Irene nor the maids made any comment, she continued, "My superiors at Scotland Yard think it their duty to try and confuse the witness as much as possible in her act of identification. They desire that a certain number of ladies wearing abnormally large hats should parade before the waitress. Among them will be, of course, the one whom the girl has already identified as being the mysterious person who had tea with Mr. Culledon at Mathis' that afternoon. My superiors can then satisfy themselves whether the waitress is or is not so sure of her statement that she invariably picks out again and again one particular individual amongst a number of others or not." "Surely," interrupted Lady Irene dryly, "you and your superiors do not expect my servants to help in such a farce?" "We don't look upon such a proceeding as a farce, Lady Irene," rejoined Lady Molly gently. "It is often resorted to in the interests of an accused person, and we certainly would ask the cooperation of your household." "I don't see what they can do." But the two girls did not seem unwilling. The idea appealed to them, I felt sure. It suggested an exciting episode, and gave promise of variety in their monotonous lives. "I am sure both these young ladies possess fine big hats," continued Lady Molly with an encouraging smile. "I should not allow them to wear ridiculous headgear," retorted Lady Irene sternly. "I have the one your ladyship wouldn't wear and threw away," interposed the young parlour-maid. "I put it together again with the scraps I found in the dust-hole." There was just one instant of absolute silence, one of those magnetic moments when fate seems to have dropped the spool on which she was spinning the threads of life, and is just stooping in order to pick it up. Lady Irene raised a black-bordered handkerchief to her lips, then said quietly, "I don't know what you mean, Mary. I never wear big hats." "No, my lady," here interposed the lady's maid, "but Mary means the one you ordered at Sanchez's and only wore the once,
The day you went to that concert." "Which day was that?" asked Lady Molly blandly. "Oh, I couldn't forget that day," ejaculated the maid. "Her ladyship came home from the concert. I had undressed her, and she told me that she would never wear her big hat again, it was too heavy. That same day Mr. Culledon was murdered." "That hat would answer our purpose very well," said Lady Molly quite calmly. "Perhaps Mary will go and fetch it, and you had better go and help her put it on." The two girls went out of the room without another word, and there were we three women left facing one another, with that awful secret, only half revealed, hovering in the air like an intangible spectre. "What are you going to do, Lady Irene?" asked Lady Molly after a moment's pause, during which I literally could hear my own heart beating, whilst I watched the rigid figure of the widow in deep black crape, her face set and white, her eyes fixed steadily on Lady Molly. "You can't prove it," she said defiantly. "I think we can," rejoined Lady Molly simply. "At any rate, I mean to try. I have two of the waitresses from Mathis' outside in a cab, and I have already spoken to the attendant who served you at Sanches, an obscure milliner in a back street near Portland Road. We know that you were at great pains there to order a hat of certain dimensions and to your own minute description. It was a copy of one you had once seen Miss Löwenthal wear, when you met her at your late husband's office. We can prove that meeting too. Then we have your maid's testimony that you wore that same hat once, and once only, the day, presumably, that you went out to a concert, a statement which you will find it difficult to substantiate, and also the day on which your husband was murdered." "Bah! The public will laugh at you," retorted Lady Irene, still defiantly. "You would not dare to formulate so monstrous a charge." "It will not seem monstrous when justice has weighed in the balance the facts which we can prove. Let me tell you a few of these, the result of careful investigation. There is the fact that you knew of Mr. Culledon's entanglement with Miss Elizabeth Löwenthal, and did your best to keep it from old Mrs. Steinberg's knowledge, realizing that any scandal round her favourite nephew would result in the old lady cutting him, and therefore you, out of her will. You dismissed a parlour-maid for the sole reason that she had been present when Miss Löwenthal was shown into Mr. Culledon's study. There is the fact that Mrs. Steinberg had so worded her will that, in the event of her nephew dying before her, her fortune would devolve on you. The fact that Miss Löwenthal's action for breach of promise against your husband, your last hope of keeping the scandal from the old lady's ears, had effectually vanished. You saw the fortune eluding your grasp. You feared Mrs. Steinberg would alter her will. Had you found the means, and had you dared, would you not rather have killed the old lady? But discovery would have been certain. The other crime was bolder and surer. You have inherited the old lady's millions, for she never knew of her nephew's earlier peccadilloes. All this we can state and prove, and the history of the hat, bought and worn one day only, that same memorable day, and then thrown away." A loud laugh interrupted her, a laugh that froze my very marrow. "There is one fact you have forgotten, my Lady of Scotland Yard," came in sharp, strident accents from the black-robed figure, which seemed to have become strangely spectral in the fast-gathering gloom which had been enveloping the luxurious little boudoir. "Don't omit to mention the fact that the accused took the law into her own hands." And before my dear lady and I could rush to prevent her, Lady Irene Culledon had conveyed something, we dared not think what, to her mouth. "Find Danvers, quick, Mary," said Lady Molly calmly. "You'll find him outside. Bring a doctor back with you." Even as she spoke, Lady Irene, with a cry of agony, fell senseless in my dear lady's arms. The doctor, I may tell you, came too late. The unfortunate woman evidently had a good knowledge of poisons. She had been determined not to fail. In case of discovery, she was ready and able to mete out justice to herself. I don't think the public ever knew the real truth about the woman in the big hat. Interest in her went the way of all things. Yet my dear lady had been right from beginning to end. With unerring precision she had placed her dainty finger on the real motive and the real perpetrator of the crime, the ambitious woman who had married solely for money, and meant to have that money even at the cost of one of the most dastardly murders that have ever darkened the criminal annals of this country. I asked Lady Molly what it was that first made her think of Lady Irene as the possible murderess.
No one else for a moment had thought her guilty. "The big hat," replied my lady with a smile. "Had the mysterious woman at Mathis's been tall, the waitresses would not, one and all, have been struck by the abnormal size of the hat. The wearer must have been petite, hence the reason that under a wide brim only the chin would be visible. I at once sought for a small woman. Our fellows did not think of that, because they are men." You see how simple it all was. End of The Woman in the Big Hat. Chapter 11 of Lady Molly of Scotland Yard by Baroness Orczy. Sir Jeremiah's Will, Part 1. Many people have asked me whether I knew when and in what circumstances Lady Molly joined the detective staff at Scotland Yard, who she was, and how she managed to keep her position in society, as she undoubtedly did, whilst exercising a profession which usually does not make for high social standing. Well, of course, there is much that I have known all along about my dear lady, just as much, in fact, as her aristocratic friends and relations did, but I had promised her not to let the general public know anything of her private life until she gave me leave to do so. Now things have taken a different turn, and I can tell you all I know. But I must go back some years for that, and recall to your mind that extraordinary crime known in those days as the Baddock Will case, which sent one of the most prominent and popular young men in society to penal servitude, a life sentence, mind you, which was considered to be remarkably lenient by a number of people who thought that Captain de Mazareen ought to have been hanged. He was such a good-looking young soldier in those days. I specially remember him at the late Queen's funeral, one of the tallest men in the British Army, and with that peculiar charm of manner which, alas, one has ceased to associate with young Englishmen nowadays. If to these two undeniable advantages you add the one that Hubert de Mazareen was the dearly loved grandson of Sir Jeremiah Baddock, the multi-millionaire ship-owner of Liverpool, you will realize how easy it was for that young guardsman to ingratiate himself with every woman in society, and more particularly with every mamma who had a marriageable daughter. But fate and love have a proverbial knack of making a muddle of things. Captain de Mazareen, with a bevy of pretty and eligible girls from whom to select a wife, chose to fall in love with the one woman in the whole of England who, in his grandfather's opinion, should have remained a stranger, even an enemy, to him. You remember the sad story, more than a quarter of a century old now, of Sir Jeremiah's unhappy second marriage with the pretty French actress, Mademoiselle Adèle d'Este, who was then over 30 years younger than himself. He married her abroad and never brought her to England. She made him supremely wretched for about 3 years, and finally ran away with the Earl of Flintshire, whom she had met at Monte Carlo. Well, it was with a daughter of that same Earl of Flintshire, Lady Molly Robertson-Kirk, that Captain Hubert de Mazareen fell desperately in love. Imagine Sir Jeremiah's feelings when he heard of it. Captain Hubert, you must know, had resigned his commission in 1902 at his grandfather's request, when the latter's health first began to fail. He had taken up his permanent abode at Appledore Castle, Sir Jeremiah's magnificent home in Cumberland, and, of course, it was generally understood that ultimately he would become possessed of the wealthy ship-owner's millions as well as of the fine property, seeing that his mother had been Sir Jeremiah's only child by the latter's first marriage. Lord Flintshire's property was quite close to Appledore, but needless to say, old Sir Jeremiah never forgave his noble neighbour the cruel wrong he had suffered at his hands. The second Lady Baddock, afterwards Countess of Flintshire, has been dead 20 years. Neither the county nor the more exclusive sets of London ever received her, but her daughter Molly, who inherited all her beauty and none of her faults, was the idol of her father, and the acknowledged queen of county and town society. You see, it was the ancient, yet ever new, story of Cappelletti and Montecchi over again, and one day Captain Hubert de Mazareen had to tell Sir Jeremiah that he desired to marry the daughter of his grandfather's most cruel enemy. What the immediate result of that announcement was, no one could say. Neither Sir Jeremiah nor Captain Hubert de Mazareen would have allowed servants or dependents to hear a word of disagreement that might have passed between them, much less to suspect that an unpleasant scene had occurred. Outwardly everything went on as usual at Appledore Castle for about a fortnight or so, after which Captain Hubert went away one day, ostensibly for a brief stay in London, but he never re-entered the doors of the castle until after the dark veil of an appalling tragedy had begun to descend on the stately old Cumberland home. Sir Jeremiah bore up pretty well for a time, then he had a slight paralytic stroke and became a confirmed invalid. The postmaster at Appledore declared that after many letters came, addressed to Sir Jeremiah in Captain Hubert's well-known handwriting, and bearing the London postmark. But presumably the old gentleman felt bitterly irreconcilable toward his grandson, for Captain de Mazareen was never seen at the castle. Soon the invalid grew more and more eccentric and morose. He ordered all the reception rooms of his magnificent home to be closed and shuttered, and he dismissed all his indoor servants, with the exception of his own male attendant and an old married couple named Bradley, who had been in his service for years, and who now did the little work that was required in what had once been one of the most richly appointed country mansions in England. Bitter resentment against his once dearly loved grandson, and against the man who had robbed him of his young wife 25 years ago, seemed to have cut off the old man from contact with the outside world. Thus matters stood until the spring of 1903, when Sir Jeremiah announced one morning to the 3 members of his household that Mr. Philip Baddock was coming to stay at the castle, and that a room must be got ready immediately. Mr. Philip Baddock came that same evening. He was a young man of quite ordinary appearance, short, rather dark, with the somewhat uncouth manners suggestive of an upbringing in a country parsonage. His arrival created no little excitement in the neighbourhood. Who was Mr. Philip Baddock, and where did he come from? No one had ever heard of him before, and now, after a very brief time spent at the castle, he seemed to be gradually taking up the position which originally had belonged to Captain Hubert. He took over the command of the small household, dismissing Sir Jeremiah's personal attendant after a while, and engaging another. He supervised the outdoor men, reducing the staff both in the gardens and the stables. He sold most of the horses and carriages, and presently bought a motor car, which he at once took to driving all over the country. But he spoke to no one in the village, and soon, in answer to inquiries by 1 or 2 of Sir Jeremiah's faithful friends and cronies, the reply came regularly from Mr. Philip Baddock that the invalid was disinclined for company. Only Dr. Thorne, the local practitioner, saw the patient. Sir Jeremiah, it was understood, was slowly sinking towards the grave, but his mind was quite clear, even if his temper was abnormal. One day Mr. Philip Baddock made inquiries in the village for a good chauffeur. George Taylor presented himself, and was at once told off to drive the car as quickly as possible to Carlisle, to the office of Mr. Stedman, solicitor, and to bring that gentleman back to the castle as soon as he could come. The distance from Appledore to Carlisle is over 50 miles. It was 7 o'clock in the evening before George Taylor was back, bringing Mr. Stedman with him. The solicitor was received at the castle door by old Bradley, and at Sir Jeremiah's door by Felkin, the new attendant, who showed him in. The interview between the invalid and Mr. Stedman lasted half an hour, after which the latter was driven back to Carlisle by George Taylor. That same evening a telegram was sent off by Mr. Philip Baddock to Captain de Mazareen in London, containing the few words, "Sir Jeremiah very ill. Come at once." 24 hours later Captain Hubert arrived at Appledore Castle, too late, however, to see his grandfather alive. Sir Jeremiah Baddock had died an hour before the arrival of his once so tenderly cherished grandson, and all hopes of a reconciliation had now been mercilessly annihilated by death. The end had come much more suddenly than Dr. Thorne had anticipated. He had seen the patient in the morning, and thought that he might last some days. But when Sir Jeremiah had heard that Captain de Mazareen had been sent for, he had worked himself into a state of such terrible agitation that the poor overtaxed brain and heart finally gave way. Sir Jeremiah's Will, Part II. The events of those memorable days, in the early spring of 1904, are so graven on my memory that I can recount them as if they happened yesterday. I was maid to Lady Molly Robertson-Kirk at the time. Since then she has honoured me with her friendship. Directly after Captain Hubert's first estrangement from his grandfather, she and I came down to Cumberland and lived very quietly at Kirk Hall, which, as you know, is but a stone's throw from Appledore. Here Captain Hubert paid my dear lady several visits. She had irrevocably made up her mind that their engagement was to be indefinitely prolonged, for she had a vague hope that, sooner or later, Sir Jeremiah would relent towards the grandson whom he had loved so dearly. At any rate, there was a chance of it whilst the marriage had not actually taken place. Captain de Mazareen, mind you, was in no sense of the word badly off. His father had left him some £25,000, and Lady Molly had a small private fortune of her own. Therefore I assure you that there was not a single mercenary thought behind this protracted engagement, or Captain Hubert's desire for a reconciliation with his grandfather. The evening that he arrived at Appledore in response to Mr. Philip Baddock's telegram, Lady Molly met him at the station. He sent his luggage on to Kirk Hall, and the two young people walked together as far as Elkhorn Woods, which divide the Earl of Flintshire's property from Appledore itself. Here they met Mr. Stedman, the solicitor, who had motored over from Carlisle in response to an urgent summons from Sir Jeremiah Baddock, but whose car had broken down about 200 yards up the road. It seems that the chauffeur had suggested his walking on through the woods, it being an exceptionally fine and mild spring evening, with a glorious full moon overhead, which lit up almost every turn of the path that cuts through the pretty coppice. Lady Molly had given me rendezvous at the edge of the wood, so that I might accompany her home after she had taken leave of Captain Hubert. It seems that the latter knew Mr. Stedman slightly, as we saw the two men shake hands with one another. Then, after a few words of conversation, turn off to walk together through the wood. We then made our way back silently to Kirk Hall. My dear lady was inexpressibly sad. She appreciated very deeply the love which Captain Hubert bore for his grandfather, and was loath to see the final annihilation of all her hopes of an ultimate reconciliation between the two men. I had dressed Lady Molly for dinner, and she was just going downstairs when Captain de Mazareen arrived at the Hall. He announced the sad news of his grandfather's death and looked extremely dejected and upset. Of course he stayed at the Hall, for Mr. Philip Baddock seemed quite to have taken command at Appledore Castle, and Captain Hubert did not care to be beholden to him for hospitality. My dear lady asked him what had become of Mr. Stedman. "I don't know," he replied. "He started to walk with me through the wood, then he seemed to think that the tramp would be too much for him, and that the car would be put right very quickly. He preferred to drive round, and was quite sure that he would meet me at the castle in less than half an hour. However, he never turned up." Lady Molly asked several more questions about Sir Jeremiah, which Captain Hubert answered in a listless way. He had been met at the door of the castle by Mr. Philip Baddock, who told him that the old gentleman had breathed his last half an hour before. I remember that we all went to bed that night feeling quite unaccountably depressed. It seemed that something more tragic than the natural death of a septuagenarian hovered in the air of these remote Cumberland villages. The next morning our strange premonitions were confirmed. Lord Flintshire, my dear lady, and Captain Hubert were sitting at breakfast when the news was brought to the Hall that Mr. Stedman, the Carlisle solicitor, had been found murdered in the Elkhorn Woods earlier in the morning. Evidently he had been stunned, and then done to death by a heavily loaded stick or some similar weapon. When he was discovered in the early hours of the morning, he had apparently been dead some time. The local police were at once apprised of the terrible event, which created as much excitement as the death of the eccentric old millionaire at Appledore Castle. Everyone at Kirk Hall, of course, was keenly interested, and Captain de Mazareen went over to Appledore as soon as he could in order to place his information at the service of the police. It is a strange fact, but nevertheless a true one, that when a deadly peril arises such as now threatened Captain de Mazareen, the person most in danger is the last to be conscious of it. I am quite sure that Lady Molly, the moment she heard that Mr. Stedman had been murdered in the Elkhorn Woods, realized that the man she loved would be implicated in that tragedy in some sinister manner. But that is the intuition of a woman who loves. As for Captain Hubert, he went about during the whole of that day quite unconscious of the abyss which already was yawning at his feet. He even discussed quite equably the several valuable bits of information which the local police had already collected, and which eventually formed a portion of that damning fabric of circumstantial evidence which was to bring him within sight of the gallows. Earlier in the day Mr. Philip Baddock sent him a stiff little note, saying that, as Captain de Mazareen was now the owner of Appledore Castle, he, Philip Baddock, did not desire to trespass a moment longer than was necessary on his relative's hospitality, and had arranged to stay at the village inn until after the funeral, when he would leave Cumberland. To this Captain Hubert sent an equally curt note saying that, as far as he knew, he had no say in the matter of anyone coming or going from the castle, and that Mr. Philip Baddock must, of course, please himself as to whether he stayed there or not. So far, of course, the old gentleman's testamentary dispositions were not known. He had made a will in 1902, bequeathing Appledore and everything he possessed unconditionally to his beloved grandson, Hubert de Mazareen, whom he also appointed his sole executor. That will was lodged with Mr. Truscott, who had been solicitor to the deceased practically until the last moment, when Mr. Stedman, a new arrival at Carlisle, had been sent for. Whether that will had been revoked or not, Mr. Truscott did not know, but in the course of the afternoon Lord Flintshire, whilst out driving, met the local superintendent of police, who told him that Mr. Stedman's senior partner, a Mr. Fueling, had made a statement to the effect that Sir Jeremiah had sent for Mr. Stedman the day before his death and given instructions for the drafting of a new will whereby the old gentleman bequeathed Appledore and everything he possessed to his beloved grandson Hubert de Mazareen, but only on the condition that the latter did not marry the daughter or any other relative of the Earl of Flintshire. In the event of Hubert de Mazareen disregarding this condition at any future time of his life, Sir Jeremiah's entire fortune was to devolve on Philip Baddock, sole issue of testator's second marriage with Adele Desty. The draft of this will, added Mr. Fueling, was in Mr. Stedman's pocket, ready for Sir Jeremiah's signature on that fateful night when the unfortunate young solicitor was murdered. The draft had not been found in the murdered man's pocket. A copy of it, however, was in Mr. Fueling's safe. But as this will had never been signed by the deceased, the one of 1902 remained valid, and Captain Hubert de Mazareen remained unconditionally his grandfather's sole heir. Sir Jeremiah's Will, Part 3. Events crowded thick and fast on that day, one of the most miserable I have ever lived through. After an early tea which my dear lady had alone in her little boudoir, she sent me down to ask Captain Hubert to come up and speak to her. He did so at once, and I went into the next room, which was Lady Molly's bedroom, to prepare her dress for the evening. I had, of course, discreetly closed the door of communication between the two rooms, but after the first 5 minutes Lady Molly deliberately reopened it, from which I gathered that she actually wished me to know what was going on. It was then a little after 4 o'clock. I could hear Captain de Mazareen's voice, low-toned and infinitely tender. He adored my dear lady, but he was a very quiet man, and it was only by the passionate tensity of his attitude when he was near her that a shrewdly observant person could guess how deeply he cared. Now through the open door I could see his handsome head bowed very low, so that he could better look into her upturned eyes. His arms were round her, as if he were fighting the world for the possession of her, and would never let her go again. But there were tears in her eyes. "Hubert," she said after a while, "I want you to marry me, will you?" "Will I?" he whispered, with an intensity of passionate longing which seemed to me then so unutterably pathetic that I could have sat down and had a good cry. "But," rejoined Lady Molly earnestly, "I mean as soon as possible. To-morrow, by special licence. You can wire to Mr. Herford to-night, and he will see about it first thing in the morning. We can travel up to town by the night train. Father and Mary will come with me. Father has promised, you know, and we can be married to-morrow. I think that would be the quickest way." There was a pause. I could well imagine how astonished and perturbed Captain Hubert must be feeling. It was such a strange request for a woman to make at such a time. I could see by the expression of his eyes that he was trying to read her thoughts. But she looked up quite serenely at him, and frankly, I do not think that he had the slightest inkling of the sublime motive at the back of her strange insistence. "You prefer to be married in London rather than here?" he asked quite simply. "Yes," she replied, "I desire to be married in London to-morrow." A few moments later my dear lady quietly shut the door again, and I heard and saw no more, but half an hour later she called me. She was alone in her boudoir, bravely trying to smile through a veil of tears. Captain Hubert's footsteps could still be heard going along the hall below. Lady Molly listened until the final echo of that tread died away in the distance. Then she buried her sweet face on my shoulder and sobbed her very heart out. "Get ready as quick as you can, Mary," she said to me when the paroxysm had somewhat subsided. "We go up to town by the 9:10. "Is his lordship coming with us, my lady?" I asked. "Oh, yes," she said, whilst a bright smile lit up her face. "Father is simply grand. And yet he knows." "Knows what, my lady?" I queried instinctively, for Lady Molly had paused, and I saw a look of acute pain once more darken her soft grey eyes. "My father knows," she said slowly and almost tonelessly, "that half an hour ago the police found a weighted stick in the Elkhorn woods, not far from the spot where Mr. Stedman was murdered. The stick has the appearance of having been very vigorously cleaned and scraped recently, in spite of which fact tiny traces of blood are still visible on the leaden knob. The inspector showed my father that stick. I saw it too. It is the property of Captain Hubert de Mazareen, and by tomorrow, at the latest, it will be identified as such." There was silence in the little boudoir now, a silence broken only by the sound of dull sobs which rose from my dear lady's overburdened heart. Lady Molly at this moment had looked into the future, and with that unerring intuition that has since been of such immense service to her, she had already perceived the grim web which fate was weaving round the destiny of the man she loved. I said nothing. What could I say? I waited for her to speak again. The first words she uttered after the terrible pronouncement which she had just made were, "I'll wear my white cloth gown tomorrow, Mary. It is the most becoming frock I have, and I want to look my best on my wedding day." Sir Jeremiah's Will, Part 4. Captain Hubert de Mazareen was married to Lady Molly Robertson-Kirk by special licence on April 22nd, 1904, at the Church of St. Margaret, Westminster. No one was present to witness the ceremony except the Earl of Flintshire and myself. No one was apprised of the event at the time, nor until recently did anyone know that Lady Molly of Scotland Yard was the wife of de Mazareen, the convict. As you know, he was arrested at Appledore railway station the following morning and charged with the wilful murder of Alexander Stedman, solicitor, of Carlisle. Everything was against him from the first. The draft of the will which Mr. Stedman was taking up to Sir Jeremiah for signature supplied the motive for the alleged crime, and he was the last person seen in company with the murdered man. The chauffeur, George Taylor, who had driven to Carlisle to fetch Mr. Stedman, and brought him back that evening, explained how two of his tires burst almost simultaneously after going over a bit of broken road close to the coppice. He had suggested to Mr. Stedman the idea of walking through the wood, and, as he had not two fresh tires with him, he started pushing his car along, as the village was not more than half a mile away. He never saw Mr. Stedman again. The stick with which the terrible deed had been committed was the most damning piece of evidence against the accused. It had been identified as his property by more than one witness, and was found within 20 yards of the victim, obviously cleaned and scraped, but still bearing minute traces of blood. Moreover, it had actually been seen in Captain Hubert's hand by one or two of the porters when he arrived at Appledore station on that fatal night, was met there by Lady Molly, and subsequently walked away with her previous to meeting Mr. Stedman on the edge of the wood. Captain de Mazareen, late of His Majesty's Household Brigade, was indicted for the wilful murder of Alexander Stedman, tried at the next assizes, found guilty, and condemned to be hanged. The jury, however, had strongly recommended him to mercy owing to his hitherto spotless reputation, and to the many services he had rendered his country during the last Boer War. A monster petition was sent up to the Home Office, and the sentence was commuted to 20 years' penal servitude. That same year Lady Molly applied for and obtained a small post on the detective staff of the police. From that small post she has worked her way upwards, analysing and studying, exercising her powers of intuition and of deduction, until at the present moment she is considered, by chiefs and men alike, the greatest authority among them on criminal investigation. The Earl of Flintshire died some 3 years ago. Kirk Hall devolved on a distant cousin, but Lady Molly has kept a small home at Kirk ready for her husband when he comes back from Dartmoor. The task of her life is to apply her gifts, and the obvious advantages at her disposal as a prominent member of the detective force, to prove the innocence of Captain Hubert de Mazareen, whom she never doubted for a moment. But it was sublime, and at the same time deeply pathetic, to see the frantic efforts at self-sacrifice which these two noble-hearted young people made for one another's sake. Directly Captain Hubert realized that, so far as proving his innocence was concerned, he was a lost man, he used every effort to release Lady Molly from the bonds of matrimony. The marriage had been, and was still, kept a profound secret. He determined to plead guilty to murder at his trial, and then to make a declaration that he had entrapped Lady Molly into a marriage, knowing at the time that a warrant was out for his arrest, and hoping, by his connection with the Earl of Flintshire, to obtain a certain amount of leniency. When he was sufficiently convinced that such a course was out of the question, he begged Lady Molly to bring a nullity suit against him. He would not defend it. He only wished to set her free. But the love she bore him triumphed over all. They did keep their marriage a secret, but she remained faithful to him in every thought and feeling within her, and loyal to him with her whole soul. Only I, once her maid, now her devoted friend, knew what she suffered, even whilst she threw herself heart and mind into her work. We lived mostly in our little flat in Maida Vale, but spent some delightful days of freedom and peace in the little house at Kirk. Hither, in spite of the terrible memories the place evoked, Lady Molly loved to spend her time in wandering over the ground where that mysterious crime had been committed which had doomed an innocent man to the life of a convict. "That mystery has to be cleared up, Mary," she would repeat to me with unswerving loyalty, "and cleared up soon, before Captain de Mazareen loses all joy in life and all belief in me." Sir Jeremiah's Will, Part 5. I suspect you will be interested to hear something about Appledore Castle and about Mr. Philip Baddock, who had been so near getting an immense fortune, yet had it snatched from him before his very eyes. As Sir Jeremiah Baddock never signed the will of 1904, Captain de Mazareen's solicitors on his behalf sought to obtain probate of the former one, dated 1902. In view of the terrible circumstances connected with the proposed last testamentary dispositions of the deceased, Mr. Philip Baddock was advised to fight that suit. It seems that he really was the son of Sir Jeremiah by the latter's second marriage with Mademoiselle d'Este, but the old gentleman, with heartless vengefulness, had practically repudiated the boy from the first, and absolutely refused to have anything to do with him beyond paying for his maintenance and education, and afterwards making him a goodly allowance on the express condition that Philip, soon to become a young man, never set his foot on English soil. The condition was strictly complied with. Philip Baddock was born abroad, and lived abroad until 1903, when he suddenly appeared at Appledore Castle. Whether Sir Jeremiah, in a fit of tardy repentance, had sent for him, or whether he risked coming of his own accord, no one ever knew. Captain de Mazareen was not, until that same year, 1903, aware of the existence of Philip Baddock, any more than was anybody else, and he spent his last days of freedom in stating positively that he would not accept the terms of the will of 1902, but would agree to Sir Jeremiah's fortune being divided up as it would have been if the old gentleman had died intestate. Thus Philip Baddock, the son, and Hubert de Mazareen, the grandson, received an equal share of Sir Jeremiah's immense wealth, estimated at close upon £2,000,000 sterling. Appledore was put up for sale and bought in by Mr. Philip Baddock, who took up his residence there and gradually gained for himself a position in the county as one of the most wealthy magnates in the north of England. Thus he became acquainted with the present Lord Flintshire, and later on met my dear lady. She neither sought nor avoided his acquaintance, and even went once to a dinner party at Appledore Castle. That was lately, on the occasion of our last stay at Kirk. I had gone up to the castle in the brougham so that I might accompany Lady Molly home, and had been shown into the library, whither my dear lady came in order to put on her cloak. While she was doing so, Mr. Philip Baddock came in. He had a newspaper in his hand and seemed greatly agitated. "Such extraordinary news, Lady Molly," he said, pointing to a headline in the paper. "You know, of course, that the other day a convict succeeded in effecting his escape from Dartmoor?" "Yes, I knew that," said my dear lady quietly. "Well, I have reason to suppose," continued Mr. Baddock, "that that convict was none other than my unfortunate nephew, de Mazareen." "Yes," rejoined Lady Molly, whose perfect calm and serene expression of face contrasted strangely with the obvious agitation of Philip Baddock. "Heaven knows that he tried to do me an evil turn," rejoined the latter after a while, "but of course I bear him no grudge, now that the law has given me that which he tried to wrench from me, a just share of my father's possessions. Since he has thrown himself on my mercy—" "Thrown himself on your mercy!" ejaculated my dear lady, whose face had become almost grey with a sudden fear. "What do you mean?" "De Mazareen is in my house at the present moment," replied Mr. Baddock quietly. "Here?" "Yes, it seems that he tramped here. I am afraid that his object was to try and see you. He wants money, of course. I happened to be out in the woods this afternoon and saw him. No," added Philip Baddock quickly, in response to an instinctive gasp of pain from Lady Molly. "You need not have the slightest fear. My nephew is as safe with me as he would be in your own house. I brought him here, for he was exhausted with fatigue and want of food. None of my servants know of his presence in the house except Felkin, whom I can trust. By tomorrow he will have rested. We'll make a start in the very early morning in my car. We'll get to Liverpool before midday. De Mazareen shall wear Felkin's clothes. No one will know him. One of the Baddock steamers is leaving for Buenos Ayres the same afternoon,
and I can arrange with the captain. You need not have the slightest fear," he repeated, with simple yet earnest emphasis. "I pledge you my word that the Mazarine will be safe." "I should like to thank you," she murmured. "Please don't," he rejoined with a sad smile. "It is a great happiness to me to be able to do this. I know that you cared for him at one time. I wish you had known and trusted me in those days. But I am glad of this opportunity which enables me to tell you that, even had my father signed his last will and testament, I should have shared his fortune with the Mazarine. The man whom you honoured with your love need never have resorted to crime in order to gain a fortune." Philip Baddock paused. His eyes were fixed on Lady Molly with unmistakable love and an appeal for sympathy. I had no idea that he cared for her, nor had she, I am quite sure. Her heart belonged solely to the poor fugitive convict, but she could not fail, I thought, to be touched by the other man's obvious sincerity and earnestness. There was silence in the room for a few moments. Only the old clock in its Sheraton case ticked on in solemn imperturbability. Lady Molly turned her luminous eyes on the man who had just made so simple, so touching a profession of love. Was she about to tell him that she was no longer free, that she bore the name of the man whom the law had ostracized and pronounced a criminal, who had even now, by this daring attempt at escape, added a few years to his already long term of punishment, and another load to his burden of shame? "Do you think," she asked quietly, "that I might speak to Captain de Mazarine for a few moments without endangering his safety?" Mr. Baddock did not reply immediately. He seemed to be pondering over the request. Then he said, "I will see that everything is safe. I don't think there need be any danger." He went out of the room, and my dear lady and I were left alone for a minute or two. She was so calm and serene that I marvelled at her self-control, and wondered what was going on in her mind. "Mary," she said to me, speaking very quickly, for already we could hear two men's footsteps approaching the library door, "you must station yourself just outside the front door. You understand? If you see or hear anything suspicious, come and warn me at once." I made ready to obey, and the next moment the door opened, and Mr. Philip Baddock entered, accompanied by Captain Hubert. I smothered the involuntary sob which rose to my throat at the sight of the man who had once been the most gallant, the most handsomest soldier I had ever seen. I had only just time to notice that Mr. Baddock prepared to leave the room again immediately. At the door he turned back and said to Lady Molly, "Felkin has gone down to the lodge. If he hears or sees anything that seems suspicious, he will ring up on the telephone," and he pointed to the apparatus which stood on the library table in the centre of the room. After that he closed the door, and I was left to imagine the moments of joy mingled with acute anguish which my dear lady would be living through. I walked up and down restlessly on the terrace which fronts the castle. The house itself appeared silent and dark. I presume all the servants had gone to bed. Far away on my right I caught the glimmer of a light. It came from the lodge where Felkin was watching. From the church in Appledore village came the sound of the clock striking the hour of midnight. How long I had been on the watch I cannot say, when suddenly I was aware of a man's figure running rapidly along the drive towards the house. The next moment the figure had skirted the castle, apparently making for one of the back doors. I did not hesitate a moment. Having left the big front door on the latch, I ran straight in and made for the library door. Already Mr. Philip Baddock had forestalled me. His hand was on the latch. Without more ado he pushed open the door, and I followed him in. Lady Molly was sitting on the sofa, with Captain Hubert beside her. They both rose at our entrance. "The police," said Mr. Baddock, speaking very rapidly. "Felkin has just rung up from the lodge. He is getting the car ready. Pray God we may yet be able to get away." Even as he spoke, the front door-bell sounded with a loud clang, which to me had the sound of a death-knell. "It is too late, you see," said my dear lady quietly. "No, not too late," ejaculated Philip Baddock in a rapid whisper. "Quick, de Mazarine, follow me through the hall. Felkin is at the stables getting the car ready. It will be some time before the servants are roused." "Mary, I am sure, has failed to fasten the front door," interrupted Lady Molly, with the same strange calm. "I think the police are already in the hall." There was no mistaking the muffled sound of feet treading the thick Turkey carpet in the hall. The library had but one exit. Captain Hubert was literally in a trap. But Mr. Baddock had not lost his presence of mind. "The police would never dream of searching my house," he said. "They will take my word that the Mazarine is not here. Here," he added, pointing to a tall Jacobean wardrobe which stood in an angle of the room. In there, man, and leave the rest to me."
"I am afraid that such a proceeding would bring useless trouble upon you, Mr. Baddock," once more interposed Lady Molly. "The police, if they do not at once find Captain de Mazareen, will surely search the house."
"Impossible. They would not dare."
"Indeed they would. The police know that Captain de Mazareen is here."
"I swear they do not," rejoined Mr. Baddock. "Felkin is no traitor, and no one else."
"It was I who gave the information to the police," said Lady Molly, speaking loudly and clearly. "I called up the superintendent on the telephone just now, and told him that his men would find the escaped convict hiding at Appledore Castle."
"You!"
ejaculated Mr. Baddock, in a tone of surprise and horror, not unmixed with a certain note of triumph.
"You?"
"Yes," she replied calmly. "I am of the police, you know. I had to do my duty. Open the door, Mary," she added, turning to me. Captain Hubert had not spoken a word so far. Now, when the men, led by Detective Inspector Etty, entered the room, he walked with a firm step towards them, held out his hands for the irons, and with a final look at Lady Molly, in which love, trust, and hope were clearly expressed, he passed out of the room and was soon lost to sight. My dear lady waited until the heavy footfalls had died away. Then she turned with a pleasant smile to Mr. Philip Baddock. "I thank you for your kind thoughts of me," she said, "and for your noble efforts on behalf of your nephew. My position was a difficult one. I hope you will forgive the pain I have been obliged to bring upon you."
"I will do more than forgive, Lady Molly," he said earnestly. "I will venture to hope."
He took her hand and kissed it. Then she beckoned to me, and I followed her into the hall. Our brougham, a hired one, had been waiting in the stable yard. We drove home in silence, but half an hour later, when my dear lady kissed me good night, she whispered in my ear, "And now, Mary, we'll prove him innocent." End of Sir Jeremiah's Will. Chapter 12, Part 1 of Lady Molly of Scotland Yard, by Baroness Orczy. The End, Part 1. One or two people knew that at one time Lady Molly Robertson-Kirk had been engaged to Captain Hubert de Mazareen, who was now convict number 97, undergoing a life sentence for the murder of Mr. Stedman, a solicitor of Carlisle, in the Elkhorn Woods in April 1904. Few, on the other hand, knew of the secret marriage solemnized on that never-to-be-forgotten afternoon, when all of us present in the church, with the exception of the bridegroom himself, were fully aware that proofs of guilt, deadly and irrefutable, were even then being heaped up against the man to whom Lady Molly was plighting her troth, for better or for worse, with her mental eyes wide open, her unerring intuition keen to the fact that nothing but a miracle could save the man she loved from an ignoble condemnation, perhaps from the gallows. The husband of my dear lady, the man whom she loved with all the strength of her romantic and passionate nature, was duly tried and convicted of murder. Condemned to be hanged, he was reprieved, and his sentence commuted to penal servitude for life. The question of Sir Jeremiah's estate became a complicated one, for his last will and testament was never signed, and the former one, dated 1902, bequeathed everything he possessed unconditionally to his beloved grandson Hubert. After much legal argument, which it is useless to recapitulate here, it was agreed between the parties, and ratified in court, that the deceased gentleman's vast wealth should be disposed of as if he had died intestate. One half of it, therefore, went to Captain Hubert de Mazareen, grandson, and the other half to Philip Baddock, the son. The latter bought Appledore Castle and resided there, whilst his nephew became number 97 in Dartmoor Prison. Captain Hubert had served 2 years of his sentence when he made that daring and successful escape which caused so much sensation at the time. He managed to reach Appledore, where he was discovered by Mr. Philip Baddock, who gave him food and shelter and got everything ready for the safe conveyance of his unfortunate nephew to Liverpool and thence to a port of safety in South America. You remember how he was thwarted in this laudable attempt by Lady Molly herself, who communicated with the police and gave up convict number 97 into the hands of the authorities once more. Of course, public outcry was loud against my dear lady's action. Sense of duty was all very well, so people argued, but no one could forget that at one time Captain Hubert de Mazareen and Lady Molly Robertson-Kirk had actually been engaged to be married, and it seemed positively monstrous for a woman to be so pitiless towards the man whom she must at one time have loved. You see how little people understood my dear lady's motives. Some went so far as to say that she had only contemplated marriage with Captain Hubert de Mazareen because he was then, presumably, the heir to Sir Jeremiah's fortune. Now, continued the gossips, she was equally ready to marry Mr. Philip Baddock, who at any rate was the happy possessor of one half of the deceased gentleman's wealth. Certainly Lady Molly's conduct at this time helped to foster this idea. Finding that even the chief was inclined to give her the cold shoulder, she shut up our flat in Maida Vale and took up her residence at the little house which she owned in Kirk, and from the windows of which she had a splendid view of stately Appledore Castle nestling among the trees on the hillside. I was with her, of course, and Mr. Philip Baddock was a frequent visitor at the house. There could be no doubt that he admired her greatly, and that she accepted his attentions with a fair amount of graciousness. The county fought shy of her. Her former engagement to Captain de Mazareen was well known, and her treachery to him, so it was called, was severely censured. Living almost in isolation in the village, her whole soul seemed wrapped in thoughts of how to unravel the mystery of the death of Mr. Stedman. Captain de Mazareen had sworn in his defence that the solicitor, after starting to walk through the Elkhorn woods with him, had feared that the tramp over rough ground would be too much for him, and had almost immediately turned back in order to regain the road. But the chauffeur, George Taylor, who was busy with the broken-down car some 200 yards up the road, never saw Mr. Stedman again, whilst Captain de Mazareen arrived at the gates of Appledore Castle alone. Here he was met by Mr. Philip Baddock, who informed him that Sir Jeremiah had breathed his last an hour before. No one at the castle recollected seeing a stick in Captain Hubert's hand when he arrived, whilst there were several witnesses who swore that he carried one at Appledore Station when he started to walk with her ladyship. The stick was found close to the body of the solicitor, and the solicitor, when he met with his terrible death, had in his pocket the draft of a will which meant disinheritance to Captain de Mazareen. Here was the awful problem which Lady Molly had to face and to solve if she persisted in believing that the man whom she loved, and whom she had married at the moment when she knew that proofs of guilt were dead against him, was indeed innocent. The End, Part 2. We had spent all the morning shopping in Carlisle, and in the afternoon we called on Mr. Fuling, of the firm of Fuling, Stedman and Company, solicitors. Lady Molly had some business to arrange in connection with the purchase of an additional bit of land to round off her little garden at Kirk. Mr. Fuling was courteous, but distinctly stiff in his manner towards the lady who was connected with the police, more especially when, her business being transacted, she seemed inclined to tarry for a little while in the busy solicitor's office, and to lead conversation round to the subject of the murder of Mr. Stedman. 5 years have gone by since then, said Mr. Fuling curtly, in response to a remark from Lady Molly. I prefer not to revive unpleasant memories. You, of course, believed Captain de Mazareen guilty, retorted my dear lady imperturbably. There were circumstances, rejoined the solicitor, and of course, I hardly knew the unfortunate young man. Messrs. Truscott and Truscott used to be the family solicitors. Yes, it seemed curious that when Sir Jeremiah wished to make his will, he should have sent for you, rather than for his accustomed lawyer, mused Lady Molly. Sir Jeremiah did not send for me, replied Mr. Fuling, with some acerbity. He sent for my junior, Mr. Stedman. Perhaps Mr. Stedman was a personal friend of his. Not at all. Mr. Stedman was a new arrival in Carlisle, and had never seen Sir Jeremiah before the day when he was sent for, and, in a brief interview, drafted the will which, alas, proved to be the primary cause of my unfortunate young partner's death. You cannot draft a will in a brief interview, Mr. Fuling, remarked Lady Molly lightly. Mr. Stedman did so, retorted Mr. Fuling curtly. Though Sir Jeremiah's mind was as clear as crystal, he was very feeble, and the interview had to take place in a darkened room. That was the only time my young partner saw Sir Jeremiah. 24 hours later they were both dead. Oh, commented my dear lady with sudden indifference. Well, I won't detain you, Mr. Fuling. Good afternoon. A few moments later, having parted from the worthy old solicitor, we were out in the street once more. The darkened room is my first ray of light, quoth Lady Molly to me, with a smile at her own paradoxical remark. When we reached home later that afternoon, we were met at the garden gate by Mr. Felkin, Mr. Philip Baddock's friend and agent, who lived with him at Appledore Castle. Mr. Felkin was a curious personality, very taciturn in manner, but a man of considerable education. He was the son of a country parson, and at the time of his father's death he had been studying for the medical profession. Finding himself unable to pursue his studies for lack of means, and being left entirely destitute, he had been forced to earn his living by taking up the less exalted calling of male nurse. It seems that he had met Mr. Philip Baddock on the Continent some years ago, and the two young men had somehow drifted into close acquaintanceship. When the late Sir Jeremiah required a personal nurse attendant, Mr. Philip Baddock sent for his friend and installed him at Appledore Castle. Here Mr. Felkin remained, even after the old gentleman's death. He was nominally called Mr. Baddock's agent, but really did very little work. He was very fond of shooting and of riding, and spent his life in the pursuit of these sports, and he always had plenty of money to spend. But everyone voted him a disagreeable bear, and the only one who ever succeeded in making him smile was Lady Molly, who always showed an unaccountable liking for the uncouth creature. Even now, when he extended a somewhat grimy hand and murmured a clumsy apology at his intrusion, she greeted him with warm effusiveness and insisted on his coming into the house. We all turned to walk along the little drive, when Mr. Baddock's car came whizzing round the corner of the road from the village. He pulled up at our gate, and the next moment had joined us in the drive. There was a very black look in his eyes, as they wandered restlessly from my dear lady's face to that of his friend. Lady Molly's little hand was even then resting on Mr. Felkin's coat sleeve. She had been in the act of leading him herself towards the house, and did not withdraw her hand when Mr. Baddock appeared upon the scene. "Burton has called about those estimates, Felton," said the latter, somewhat roughly. "He is waiting at the castle. You better take the car. I can walk home later on." "Oh, how disappointing!" exclaimed Lady Molly, with what looked uncommonly like a pout. "I was going to have such a cosy chat with Mr. Felkin, all about horses and dogs. Couldn't you see that tiresome Burton, Mr. Baddock?" she added ingenuously. I don't think that Mr. Baddock actually swore, but I am sure he was very near doing so. "Burton can wait," said Mr. Felkin curtly. "No, he cannot," retorted Philip Baddock, whose face was a frowning mirror of uncontrolled jealousy. "Take the car, Felkin, and go at once." For a moment it seemed as if Felkin would refuse to obey. The two men stood looking at each other, measuring one another's power of will and strength of passion. Hate and jealousy were clearly written in each pair of glowering eyes. Philip Baddock looked defiant, and Felkin taciturn and sulky. Close to them stood my dear lady. Her beautiful eyes literally glowed with triumph. That these two men loved her, each in his own curious, uncontrolled way, I, her friend and confidant, knew very well. I had seen and often puzzled over the feminine attacks which she had made on the susceptibilities of that morose lout Felkin. It had taken her nearly 2 years to bring him to her feet. During that time she had alternately rendered him happy with her smiles and half mad with her coquetries, whilst Philip Baddock's love for her was perpetually fanned by his ever-growing jealousy. I remember that I often thought her game a cruel one. She was one of those women whom few men could resist. If she really desired to conquer, she invariably succeeded, and her victory over Felkin seemed to me as purposeless as it was unkind. After all, she was the lawful wife of Captain de Mazarine, and to rouse hatred between two friends for the sake of her love, when that love was not hers to give, seemed unworthy of her. At this moment, when I could read deadly hatred in the faces of these two men, her cooing laugh grated unpleasantly on my ear. "Never mind, Mr. Felkin," she said, turning her luminous eyes on him. "Since you have so hard a taskmaster, you must do your duty now. But," she added, throwing a strange, defiant look at Mr. Baddock, "I shall be home this evening. Come and have our cosy chat after dinner." She gave him her hand, and he took it with a certain clumsy gallantry and raised it to his lips. I thought that Philip Baddock would strike his friend with his open hand. The veins on his temples were swollen like dark cords, and I don't think that I ever saw such an evil look in anyone's eyes before. Strangely enough, the moment Mr. Felkin's back was turned, my dear lady seemed to set herself the task of soothing the violent passions which she had wilfully aroused in the other man. She invited him to come into the house, and some 10 minutes later I heard her singing to him. When, later on, I went into the boudoir to join them at tea, she was sitting on the music stool, whilst he half bent over her, half knelt at her feet. Her hands were clasped in her lap, and his fingers were closed over hers. He did not attempt to leave her side when he saw me entering the room. In fact, he wore a triumphant air of possession, and paid her those little attentions which only an accepted lover would dare to offer. He left soon after tea, and she accompanied him to the door. She gave him her hand to kiss, and I, who stood at some little distance in the shadow, thought that he would take her in his arms, so yielding and gracious did she seem. But some look or gesture on her part must have checked him, for he turned and walked quickly down the drive. Lady Molly stood in the doorway, gazing out towards the sunset. I, in my humble mind, wondered once again what was the purport of this cruel game. The End, Part 3. Half an hour later she called to me, asked for her hat, told me to put on mine, and to come out for a stroll. As so often happened, she led the way towards the Elkhorn woods, which, in spite, or perhaps because of, the painful memories they evoked, was a very favourite walk of hers. As a rule, the wood, especially that portion of it where the unfortunate solicitor had been murdered, was deserted after sunset. The villagers declared that Mr. Stedman's ghost haunted the clearing, and that the cry of the murdered man, as he was being foully struck from behind, could be distinctly heard, echoing through the trees. Needless to say, these superstitious fancies never disturbed Lady Molly. She liked to wander over the ground where was committed that mysterious crime, which had sent to ignominy worse than death the man she loved so passionately. It seemed as if she meant to wrench its secret from the silent ground, from the leafy undergrowth, from the furtive inhabitants of the glades. The sun had gone down behind the hills, the wood was dark and still. We strolled up as far as the first clearing, where a plain granite stone, put up by Mr. Philip Baddock, marked the spot where Mr. Stedman had been murdered. We sat down on it to rest. My dear lady's mood was a silent one. I did not dare to disturb it, and for a while only the gentle hush of the leaves, stirred by the evening breeze, broke the peaceful stillness of the glade. Then we heard a murmur of voices, deep-toned and low. We could not hear the words spoken, though we both strained our ears, and presently Lady Molly arose and cautiously made her way among the trees in the direction whence the voices came, I following as closely as I could. We had not gone far when we recognized the voices, and heard the words that were said. I paused, distinctly frightened, whilst my dear lady whispered a warning "Hush!" Never in all my life had I heard so much hatred, such vengeful malignity expressed in the intonation of the human voice, as I did in the half-dozen words which now struck my ear. "You will give her up, or—" It was Mr. Felkin who spoke. I recognized his raucous delivery, but I could not distinguish either of the two men in the gloom. "Or what?" queried the other, in a voice which trembled with either rage or fear, perhaps with both. "You will give her up," repeated Felkin sullenly. "I tell you that it is an impossibility, do you understand? An impossibility for me to stand by and see her wedded to you, or to any other man for the matter of that. But that is neither here nor there," he added after a slight pause. "It is with you I have to deal now. You shan't have her. You shan't. I won't allow it, even if I have to—" He paused again. I cannot describe the extraordinary effect this rough voice, coming out of the darkness, had upon my nerves. I had edged up to Lady Molly, and had succeeded in getting hold of her hand. It was like ice, and she herself was as rigid as that piece of granite on which we had been sitting. "You seem bubbling over with covert threats," interposed Philip Baddock, with what was obviously a sneer. "What are the extreme measures to which you will resort if I do not give up the lady whom I love with all my heart, and who has honoured me to-day by accepting my hand in marriage?" "That is a lie!" ejaculated Felkin. "What is a lie?" queried the other quietly. "She has not accepted you, and you know it. You are trying to keep me away from her, arrogating rights which you do not possess. Give her up, man, give her up. It will be best for you. She will listen to me. I can win her all right, but you must stand aside for me this time. Take the word of a desperate man for it, Baddock. It will be best for you to give her up." Silence reigned in the wood for a few moments, and then we heard Philip Baddock's voice again, but he seemed to speak more calmly, almost indifferently, as I thought. "Are you going now?" he asked. "Won't you come in to dinner?" "No," replied Felkin. "I don't want any dinner, and I have an appointment for afterwards." "Don't let us part ill friends, Felkin," continued Philip Baddock in conciliatory terms. "Do you know that, personally, my feeling is that no woman on earth is worth a serious quarrel between two old friends, such as we have been?" "I'm glad you think so," rejoined the other dryly. "So long." The cracking of twigs on the moss-covered ground indicated that the two men had parted and were going their several ways. With infinite caution, and holding my hand tightly in hers, my dear lady made her way along the narrow path which led us out of the wood. Once in the road we walked rapidly, and soon reached our garden gate. Lady Molly had not spoken a word during all that time, and no one knew better than I did how to respect her silence. During dinner she tried to talk of indifferent subjects, and never once alluded to the two men whom she had thus wilfully pitted one against the other. That her calm was only on the surface, however, I realized from the fact that every sound on the gravel path outside caused her to start. She was, of course, expecting the visit of Mr. Felkin. At 8 o'clock he came. It was obvious that he had spent the past hour in wandering about in the woods. He looked untidy and unkempt. My dear lady greeted him very coldly, and when he tried to kiss her hand, she withdrew it abruptly. Our drawing-room was a double one, divided by portière curtains. Lady Molly led the way into the front room, followed by Mr. Felkin. Then she drew the curtains together, leaving me standing behind them. I concluded that she wished me to stay there and to listen, conscious of the fact that Felkin, in the agitated mood in which he was, would be quite oblivious of my presence. I almost pitied the poor man, for to me, the listener, it was at once apparent that my dear lady had only bidden him come to-night in order to torture him. For about a year she had been playing with him as a cat does with a mouse, encouraging him at times with sweet words and smiles, repelling him at others with coldness not unmixed with coquetry. But to-night her coldness was unalloyed, her voice was trenchant, her attitude almost one of contempt. I missed the beginning of their conversation, for the curtains were thick, and I did not like to go too near, but soon Mr. Felkin's voice was raised. It was harsh and uncompromising. "I suppose that I am only good enough for a summer's flirtation," he said sullenly, "but not to marry, eh? The owner of Appledore Castle, the millionaire Mr. Baddock, is more in your line." "It certainly would be a more suitable match for me," rejoined Lady Molly coolly. "He told me you had formally accepted him," said the man, with enforced calm. "Is that true?" "Partly," she replied. "But you won't marry him!" The exclamation seemed to come straight from a heart brimful of passion, of love, of hate, and of revenge. The voice had the same intonation in it which had rung an hour ago in the dark Elkhorn woods. "I may do," came in quiet accents from my dear lady. "You won't marry him," repeated Felkin roughly. "Who shall prevent me?" retorted Lady Molly, with a low, sarcastic laugh. "I will." "You!" she said contemptuously. "I told him an hour ago that he must give you up. I tell you now that you shall not be Philip Baddock's wife." "Oh!" she interposed, and I could almost see the disdainful shrug of her shoulders, the flash of contempt in her expressive eyes. No doubt it maddened him to see her so cool, so indifferent, when he had thought that he would win her. I do believe that the poor wretch loved her. She was always beautiful, but never more so than to-night, when she had obviously determined finally to dismiss him. "If you marry Philip Baddock," he said now, in a voice which quivered with uncontrolled passion, "then within 6 months of your wedding day you will be a widow, for your husband will have ended his life on the gallows." "You are mad," she retorted calmly. "That is as it may be," he replied. "I warned him to-night, and he seems inclined to heed my warning, but he won't stand aside if you beckon to him. Therefore, if you love him, take my warning. I may not be able to get you, but I swear to you, Philip Baddock shan't either. I'll see him hanged first," he added, with gruesome significance. "And you think that you can force me to do your bidding by such paltry threats?" she retorted. "Paltry threats? Ask Philip Baddock if my threats are paltry. He knows full well that in my room at Appledore Castle, safe from thievish fingers, lie the proofs that he killed Alexander Steadman in the Elkhorn woods. Oh, I wouldn't help him in his nefarious deeds until he placed himself in my hands. He had to take my terms, or leave the thing alone altogether, for he could not work without me. My wants are few, and he has treated and paid me well. Now we are rivals, and I'll destroy him before I'll let him gloat over me. Do you know how we worked it? Sir Jeremiah would not disinherit his grandson. He steadily refused to make a will in Philip Baddock's favour, but when he was practically dying we sent for Alexander Steadman, a newcomer, who had never seen Sir Jeremiah before, and I impersonated the old gentleman for the occasion.
Yes, I," he repeated with a coarse laugh. "I was Sir Jeremiah for the space of half an hour, and I think I played the part splendidly. I dictated the terms of a new will. Young Stedman never suspected the fraud for a single instant. We had darkened the room for the comedy, you see, and Stedman was destined by Baddock and myself never to set eyes on the real Sir Jeremiah. After the interview, Baddock sent for Captain de Mazareen. This was all part of his plan and mine. We engineered it all, and we knew that Sir Jeremiah could only last a few hours. We sent for Stedman again, and I myself scattered a few dozen sharp nails along the loose stones in the road where the motor car was intended to break down, thus forcing the solicitor to walk through the woods. Captain de Mazareen's appearance on the scene at that particular moment was an unrehearsed effect, which nearly upset all our plans, for had Mr. Stedman stuck to him that night, instead of turning back, he would probably be alive now, and Baddock and I would be doing time somewhere for attempted fraud. We should have been done, at any rate. Well, you know what happened. Mr. Stedman was killed. Baddock killed him, and then ran straight back to the house, just in time to greet Captain de Mazareen, who evidently had loitered on his way. But it was I who thought of the stick, as an additional precaution to avert suspicion from ourselves. Captain de Mazareen was carrying one and left it in the hall at the castle. I cut my own hand and stained the stick with it, then polished and cleaned it up, and later, during the night, deposited it in the near neighbourhood of the murdered body. Ingenious, wasn't it? I'm a clever beggar, you see. Because I was cleverer than Baddock, he could not do without me, and because he could not do without me, I made him write and sign a request, to me, to help him to manufacture a bogus will, and then to murder the solicitor who had drawn it up. And I have hidden that precious document in the wing of Appledore Castle which I inhabit. The exact spot is known only to myself. Baddock has often tried to find out, but all he knows is that these things are in that particular wing of the house. I have the document, and the draft of the will taken out of Mr. Stedman's pocket, and the short bludgeon with which he was killed. It is still stained with blood, and the rags with which I cleaned the stick. I swear that I will never make use of these things against Philip Baddock unless he drives me to it. And if you make use of what I have just told you, I'll swear that I have lied. No one can find the proofs which I hold, but on the day that you marry Baddock, I'll place them in the hands of the police." There was silence in the room. I could almost hear the beating of my own heart, so horrified, so appalled was I at the horrible tale which the man had just told to my dear lady. The villainy of the whole scheme was so terrible, and at the same time so cunning, that it seemed inconceivable that human brain could have engendered it. Vaguely in my dull mind I wondered if Lady Molly would have to commit bigamy before she could wrench from this evildoer's hands the proofs which would set her own husband free from his martyrdom. What she said I did not hear, and what he meant to retort I never knew, for at that moment my attention was attracted by the sound of running footsteps on the gravel, followed by a loud knock at our front door. Instinctively I ran to open it. Our old gardener was standing there, hatless and breathless. "Appledore Castle, miss," he stammered. "It's on fire. I thought you would like to know." Before I had time to reply, I heard a loud oath uttered close to me, and the next moment Felkin dashed out of the drawing-room into the hall. "Is there a bicycle here I can take?" he shouted to the gardener. "Yes, sir," replied the old man. "My son has one, just in that shed, sir, on your left." In fewer seconds than it takes to relate, Felkin had rushed to the shed, dragged out the bicycle, mounted it, and I think that within 2 minutes of hearing the awful news, he was bowling along the road and was soon out of sight. The End, Part 4. One wing of the stately mansion was ablaze when, a quarter of an hour later, my dear lady and I arrived upon the scene. We had come on our bicycles not long after Mr. Felkin. At the very moment that the weird spectacle burst fully upon our gaze, a loud cry of horror had just risen from the 100 or so people who stood watching the terrible conflagration, whilst the local fire brigade, assisted by Mr. Baddock's men, were working with the hydrants. That cry found echo in our own throats as we saw a man clambering, with the rapidity of a monkey, up a long ladder which had been propped up against a second-floor window of the flaming portion of the building. The red glow illuminated the large, shaggy head of Felkin, throwing for a moment into bold relief his hooked nose and straggly beard. For the space of 3 seconds, perhaps, he stood thus,
outlined against what looked like a glowing furnace behind him, and the next instant he had disappeared beyond the window embrasure. "This is madness!" came in loud accents from out the crowd in the foreground, and before one fully realized whence that voice had come, Mr. Philip Baddock was in his turn seen clambering up that awful ladder. A dozen pairs of hands reached him just in time to drag him back from the perilous ascent. He fought to free himself, but the firemen were determined, and soon succeeded in bringing him back to level ground, whilst two of them, helmeted and well equipped, took his place upon the ladder. The foremost had hardly reached the level of the first story when Felkin's figure once more appeared in the window embrasure above. He was staggering like a man drunk or fainting. His shaggy hair and beard were blown about his head by the terrible draught caused by the flames, and he waved his arms over his head, giving the impression to those below, who gazed horrified, that he was either possessed or dying. In one hand he held what looked like a great long bundle. We could see him now put one leg forward, obviously gathering strength to climb the somewhat high window ledge. With a shout of encouragement, the two firemen scrambled up with squirrel-like agility, and the cry of "They're coming! They're coming! Hold on, Felkin!" rose from 100 excited throats. The unfortunate man made another effort. We could see his face clearly now in the almost blinding glow which surrounded him. It was distorted with fear and also with agony. He gave one raucous cry, which I do believe will echo in my ears as long as I live, and with a superhuman effort he hurled the bundle which he held out of the window. At that same time there was a terrific hissing, followed by a loud crash. The floor beneath the feet of the unfortunate man must have given way, for he disappeared suddenly in a sea of flames. The bundle which he hurled down had struck the foremost fireman on the head. He lost his hold, and as he fell, he dragged his unfortunate comrade down with him. The others ran to the rescue of their comrades. I don't think they were seriously hurt, but what happened directly after among the crowd, the firemen, or the burning building, I cannot tell you. I only know that at the moment when Felkin's figure was for the second time seen in the frame of the glowing window, Lady Molly seized my hand and dragged me forward through the crowd. Her husband's life was hanging in the balance, just as much as that of the miserable wretch who was courting a horrible death for the sake of those proofs which, as it was proved afterwards, Philip Baddock tried to destroy by such drastic means. The excitement round the ladder, the fall of the two firemen, the crashing in of the floor and the gruesome disappearance of Felkin caused so much excitement in the crowd that the bundle which the unfortunate man had thrown remained unheeded for the moment. But Philip Baddock reached the spot where it fell 30 seconds after Lady Molly did. She had already picked it up when he said harshly, "Give me that. It's mine. Felkin risked his life to save it for me." Inspector Etty, however, stood close by, and before Philip Baddock realized what Lady Molly meant to do, she had turned quickly and placed the bundle in the inspector's hands. "You know me, Etty, don't you?" she said rapidly. "Oh, yes, my lady," he replied. "Then take the utmost care of this bundle. It contains proofs of one of the most dastardly crimes ever committed in this country." No other words could have aroused the enthusiasm and caution of Etty in the same manner. After that, Philip Baddock might protest, might rage, storm, or try to bribe, but the proofs of his guilt and Captain de Mazareen's innocence were safe in the hands of the police, and bound to come to light at last. But as a matter of fact, Baddock neither stormed nor pleaded. When Lady Molly turned to him once more, he had disappeared. You know the rest, of course. It occurred too recently to be recounted. Philip Baddock was found the next morning with a bullet through his head, lying on the granite stone which, with cruel hypocrisy, he himself had erected in memory of Mr. Stedman, whom he had so foully murdered. The unfortunate Felkin had not lied when he said that the proofs which he held of Baddock's guilt were conclusive and deadly. Captain de Mazareen obtained His Majesty's gracious pardon after 5 years of martyrdom which he had borne with heroic fortitude. I was not present when Lady Molly was once more united to the man who so ardently worshipped and trusted her, and to whose love, innocence, and cause she had remained so sublimely loyal throughout the past few years. She has given up her connection with the police. The reason for it has gone with the return of her happiness, over which I, her ever faithful Mary Granard, will, with your permission, draw a veil. End of Chapter 12 and the end of Lady Molly of Scotland Yard by Baroness Orczy.